Chapter 1 of The Idiot, Part 3, by Fyodor Dostoevsky, translated by Eva M. Martin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Alia Makki. Chapter 1. The Epanchin family, or at least the more serious members of it, were sometimes grieved because they seemed so unlike the rest of the world. They were not quite certain, but had at times a strong suspicion that things did not happen to them as they did to other people. Others led a quiet, uneventful life, while they were subject to continual upheavals. Others kept on the rails without difficulty; they ran off at the slightest obstacle. Other houses were governed by a timid routine; theirs was somehow different. Perhaps Lizabetha Prokofievna was alone in making these fretful observations. The girls, though not wanting in intelligence, were still young. The general was intelligent too, but narrow, and in any difficulty he was content to say and leave the matter to his wife. Consequently on her fell the responsibility. It was not that they distinguished themselves as a family by any particular originality, or that their excursions off the track led to any breach of the proprieties. Oh no! There was nothing premeditated; there was not even any conscious purpose in it all, and yet, in spite of everything, the family, although highly respected, was not quite what every highly respected family ought to be. For a long time now Lizabetha Prokofievna had had it in her mind that all the trouble was owing to her unfortunate character, and this added to her distress. She blamed her own stupid unconventional eccentricity. Always restless, always on the go, she constantly seemed to lose her way, and to get into trouble over the simplest and more ordinary affairs of life. We said at the beginning of our story that the Epanchins were liked and esteemed by their neighbours. In spite of his humble origin, Ivan Fedorovitch himself was received everywhere with respect. He deserved this, partly on account of his wealth and position, partly because, though limited, he was really a very good fellow. But a certain limitation of mind seems to be an indispensable asset, if not to all public personages, at least to all serious financiers. Added to this, his manner was modest and unassuming. He knew when to be silent, and yet never allowed himself to be trampled upon. Also, and this was more important than all, he had the advantage of being under exalted patronage. As to Lizabetha Prokofievna, she, as the reader knows, belonged to an aristocratic family. True, Russians think more of influential friends than of birth, but she had both. She was esteemed and even loved by people of consequence in society, whose example in receiving her was therefore followed by others. It seems hardly necessary to remark that her family worries and anxieties had little or no foundation, or that her imagination increased them to an absurd degree. But if you have a wart on your forehead or nose, you imagine that all the world is looking at it, and that people would make fun of you because of it, even if you had discovered America. Doubtless Lizabetha Prokofievna was considered eccentric in society, but she was none the less esteemed. The pity was that she was ceasing to believe in that esteem. When she thought of her daughters, she said to herself sorrowfully that she was a hindrance rather than a help to their future, that her character and temper were absurd, ridiculous, insupportable. Naturally she put the blame on her surroundings, and from morning to night was quarrelling with her husband and children, whom she really loved to the point of self-sacrifice, even, one might say, of passion. She was, above all, distressed by the idea that her daughters might grow up eccentric like herself. She believed that no other society girls were like them. "They're growing into nihilists," she repeated over and over again. For years she had tormented herself with this idea, and with the question, why don't they get married? It is to annoy their mother. That is their one aim in life. It can be nothing else. The fact is, it is all of a piece with these modern ideas, that wretched woman's question. 6 months ago Aglaya took a fancy to cut off her magnificent hair. Why, even I, when I was young, had nothing like it. The scissors were in her hand, and I had to go down on my knees and implore her. She did it, I know, from sheer mischief, to spite her mother. for she is a naughty, capricious girl, a real spoiled child, spiteful and mischievous to a degree. And then Alexandra wanted to shave her head, not from caprice or mischief, but like a little fool, simply because Aglaya persuaded her she would sleep better without her hair, and not suffer from headache. And how many suitors have they not had during the last 5 years? Excellent offers, too! What more do they want? Why don't they get married? For no other reason than to vex their mother. None, none!" But Lizabetha Prokofievna felt somewhat consoled when she could say that one of her girls, Adelaida, was settled at last. "It will be one off our hands," she declared aloud, though in private she expressed herself with greater tenderness. The engagement was both happy and suitable, and was therefore approved in society. Prince S. was a distinguished man, he had money, and his future wife was devoted to him. What more could be desired? Lizabetha Prokofievna had felt less anxious about this daughter, however, although she considered her artistic tastes suspicious. But to make up for them, she was, as her mother expressed it, merry, and had plenty of common sense. It was Aglaya's future which disturbed her the most. With regard to her eldest daughter, Alexandra, the mother never quite knew whether there was cause for anxiety or not. Sometimes she felt as if there was nothing to be expected from her. She was 25 now, and must be fated to be an old maid, and with such beauty too! The mother spent whole nights in weeping and lamenting, while all the time the cause of her grief slumbered peacefully. What is the matter with her? Is she a nihilist or simply a fool? But Lizabetha Prokofievna knew perfectly well how unnecessary was the last question. She set a high value on Alexandra Ivanovna's judgment, and often consulted her in difficulties. But that she was in a wet hen she never for a moment doubted. She is so calm, nothing rouses her, though wet hens are not always calm. Oh, I can't understand it! Her eldest daughter inspired Lizabetha with a kind of puzzled compassion. She did not feel this in Aglaya's case, though the latter was her idol. It may be said that these outbursts and epithets, such as "wet hen," in which the maternal solicitude usually showed itself, only made Alexandra laugh. Sometimes the most trivial thing annoyed Mrs. Epanchin and drove her into frenzy. For instance, Alexandra Ivanovna liked to sleep late, and was always dreaming, though her dreams had the peculiarity of being as innocent and naive as those of a child of 7, and the very innocence of her dreams annoyed her mother. Once she dreamt of 9 hens, and this was the cause of quite a serious quarrel. No one knew why. Another time she had it, as it was most unusual, a dream with a spark of originality in it. She dreamt of a monk in a dark room, into which she was too frightened to go. Adelaida and Aglaya rushed off with shrieks of laughter to relate this to their mother, and she was quite angry, and said her daughters were all fools. She is as stupid as a fool, a veritable wet hen. Nothing excites her, and yet she is not happy. Some days it makes one miserable only to look at her. Why is she unhappy, I wonder? At times Lizabetha Prokofievna put this question to her husband, and as usual she spoke in the threatening tone of one who demands an immediate answer. Ivan Fedorovitch would frown, shrug his shoulders, and at last give his opinion: "She needs a husband." "God forbid that he should share your ideas, Ivan Fedorovitch," his wife flashed back, "or that he should be as gross and churlish as you." The general promptly made his escape, and Lizabetha Prokofievna after a while grew calm again. That evening, of course, she would be unusually attentive, gentle, and respectful to her gross and churlish husband, her dear kind Ivan Fedorovitch, for she had never left off loving him. She was even still in love with him. He knew it well, and for his part held her in the greatest esteem. But the mother's great and continual anxiety was Aglaya. "She is exactly like me, my image in everything," said Mrs. Epanchin to herself. "A tyrant, a real little demon, a nihilist, eccentric, senseless, and mischievous. Good Lord, how unhappy she'll be!" But as we said before, the fact of Adelaida's approaching marriage was a balm to the mother. For a whole month she forgot her fears and worries. Adelida's fate was settled, and with her name that of Aglaya's was linked in society gossip. People whispered that Aglaya, too, was as good as engaged, and Aglaya always looked so sweet and behaved so well during this period, that the mother's heart was full of joy. Of course, Evgenie Pavlovitch must be thoroughly studied first, before the final step should be taken, but really, how lovely dear Aglaya had become! She actually grew more beautiful every day. And then this abominable prince showed his face again, and everything went topsy-turvy at once, and everyone seemed as mad as March hares. What had really happened? If it had been any other family than the Epanchins, nothing particular would have happened, but thanks to Mrs. Epanchin's inveritable fussiness and anxiety, there could not be the slightest hitch in the simplest matters of everyday life. But she immediately foresaw the most dreadful and alarming consequences, and suffered accordingly. What then must have been her condition, when among all the imaginary anxieties and calamities which so constantly beset her, she now saw looming ahead a serious case for annoyance, something really likely to arouse doubts and suspicions? How dared they write that hateful anonymous letter, informing me that Aglaya is in communication with Nastasia Philipovna? She thought, as she dragged the prince along towards her own house, and again when she sat him down at the round table where the family was already assembled. How dared they so much as to think of such a thing? I should die with shame if I thought there was a particle of truth in it, or if I were to show the letter to Aglaya herself. Who dares play these jokes upon us, the Epanchins? Why didn't they go to the Yelagin instead of coming down here? I told you we had better go to the Yelagin this summer, Ivan Fedorovitch. It's all your fault. I dare say it was that Varia who sent the letter. It's all Ivan Fedorovitch. That woman is doing it all for him, and I know she is, to show she can make a fool of him now, just as she did when he used to give her pearls. But after all is said, we're all mixed up in it. Your daughters are mixed up in it, Ivan Fedorovitch. Young ladies in society, young ladies at an age to be married. They're present, they heard everything there was to hear. They were mixed up with that other scene too, with those dreadful youths. You must be pleased to remember they heard it all. I cannot forgive that wretched prince. I shall never forgive him. And why, if you please, has Aglaya had an attack of nerves these last 3 days? Why has she all but quarrelled with her sisters, even with Alexandra, whom she respects so much that she always kisses her hands as though she were her mother? What are all these riddles of hers that we have to guess? What has Gavrila Ardalionovitch has to do with it? Why did she take upon herself to champion him this morning and burst into tears over it? Why is there an allusion to that cursed poor knight in the anonymous letter? And why did I rush off to him just now, like a lunatic, and drag him back here? I do believe I've gone mad at last. What on earth have I done now, to talk to a young man about my daughter's secrets, and secrets having to do with himself too? Thank goodness he's an idiot and a friend of the house. Surely Aglaya hasn't fallen in love with such a gaby. What an idea! Phew! We ought all to be put under glass cases, myself first of all, and be shown off as curiosities at 10 kopecks a peep. I shall never forgive you for all this, Ivan Fedorovitch, never. Look at her now. Why doesn't she make fun of him? She said she would, and she doesn't. Look there, she stares at him with all her eyes and doesn't move, and yet she told him not to come. He looks pale enough, and that abominable chatterbox, Evgenie Pavlovitch, monopolizes the whole conversation. Nobody else can get a word in. I could soon find out all about everything, if I could only change the subject." The prince certainly was very pale. He sat at the table and seemed to be feeling by turns sensations of alarm and rapture. Oh, how frightened he was of looking to one side, one particular corner, whence he knew very well that a pair of dark eyes were watching him intently. And how happy he was to think that he was once more among them, and occasionally hearing that well-known voice, although she had written and forbidden him to come again. "What on earth will she say to me, I wonder?" he thought to himself. He had not said a word yet. He sat silent and listened to Evgenie Pavlovitch's eloquence. The latter had never appeared so happy and excited as on this evening. The prince listened to him, but for a long time did not take in a word he said. Excepting Ivan Fedorovitch, who had not as yet returned from town, the whole family was present. Prince S. was there, and they all intended to go out to hear the band very soon. Colia arrived presently and joined the circle. So he is received as usual, after all, thought the prince. The Epanchins' country house was a charming building, built after the model of a Swiss chalet, and covered with creepers. It was surrounded on all sides by a flower garden, and the family sat, as a rule, on the open verandah, as at the prince's house. The subject under discussion did not appear to be very popular with the assembly, and some would have been delighted to change it, but Evgenie would not stop holding forth, and the prince's arrival seemed to spur him on to still further rhetorical efforts. Lizabetha Prokofievna frowned, but had not as yet grasped the subject, which seemed to have arisen out of a heated argument. Aglaya sat apart, almost in the corner, listening in stubborn silence. "Excuse me," continued Evgenie Pavlovitch hotly, "I don't say a word against liberalism. Liberalism is not a sin, it is a necessary part of a great whole, which whole would collapse and fall to pieces without it. Liberalism has as much right to exist as has the most moral conservatism. But I am attacking Russian liberalism, and I attack it for the simple reason that a Russian liberal is not a Russian liberal. He is a non-Russian liberal. Show me a real Russian liberal, and I'll kiss him before you all with pleasure." "If he cared to kiss you, that is," said Alexandra, whose cheeks were red with irritation and excitement. "Look at that now," thought her mother to herself. "She does nothing but sleep and eat for a year at a time, and then suddenly flies out in the most incomprehensible way." The prince observed that Alexandra appeared to be angry with Evgenie because he spoke on a serious subject in a frivolous manner, pretending to be in earnest, but with an undercurrent of irony. "I was saying just now, before you came in, prince, that there has been nothing national up to now about our liberalism, and nothing that liberals do or have done is in the greatest degree national. They are drawn from two classes only, the old land-owning class and the clerical families." "How, nothing that they have done is Russian?" asked Prince S. "It may be Russian, but it's not national. Our liberals are not Russians, nor are our conservatives. And you may be sure that the nation does not recognize anything that has been done by the landed gentry or by the seminarists, or what is to be done either." "Come, that's good! How can you maintain such a paradox, if you are serious, that is? I cannot allow such a statement about the landed proprietors to pass unchallenged. Why, you're a land proprietor yourself!" cried Prince S. hotly. "I suppose you'll say there is nothing national about our literature either?" said Alexandra. "Well, I'm not a great authority on literary questions, but I certainly do hold that Russian literature is not Russian, except perhaps Lomonosov, Pushkin and Gogol." "In the first place, that is a considerable admission, and in the second, one of the above was a peasant, and the other two were both landed proprietors." "Quite so, but don't be in such a hurry. For since it has been the part of these three men, and only these three, to say something absolutely their own, not borrowed, so by this very fact these three men become really national. If any Russian shall have done or said anything really and absolutely original, he is to be called national from that moment. Though he may not be able to talk the Russian language, still he is a national Russian. I consider that an axiom. But we were not speaking of literature. We began by discussing the socialists. Very well, then, I insist that there does not exist one single Russian socialist. There does not, and there has never existed such a one, because all socialists are derived from two classes, the landed proprietors and the seminarists. All our eminent socialists were merely old liberals of the class of landed proprietors, men who were liberals in the days of serfdom. Why do you laugh? Give me their book, give me their studies, their memoirs, and though I am not a literary critic, yet I will prove as clear as day that every chapter and every word of their writings has been the work of a former landed proprietor of the old school. You'll find that all their raptures, all their generous transports are proprietary, all their woes and their tears proprietary, all proprietary or seminarists. You're laughing again, and you, prince, are smiling too. Don't you agree with me?" It was true enough that everybody was laughing, the prince among them. "I cannot tell you on the instant whether I agree with you or not," said the latter, suddenly stopping his laughter and staring like a schoolboy caught at mischief. but I assure you I am listening to you with extreme gratification." So saying, he almost panted with agitation, and a cold sweat stood upon his forehead. These were his first words since he had entered the house. He tried to lift his eyes, and to look around, but dared not. Evgenie Pavlovitch noticed his confusion, and smiled. "I'll just tell you one fact, ladies and gentlemen," continued the latter with apparent seriousness, and even exaltation of manner, but with a suggestion of chaff behind every word, as though he were laughing in his sleeve at his own nonsense. "A fact the discovery of which, I believe, I may claim to have made by myself alone. At all events, no other has ever said or written a word about it, and in this fact is expressed the whole essence of Russian liberalism, of the sort which I am now considering. In the first place, what is liberalism, speaking generally, but an attack, whether mistaken or reasonable is quite another question, upon the existing order of things? Is this so? Yes. Very well. Then my fact consists in this, that Russian liberalism is not an attack upon the existing order of things, but an attack upon the very essence of things themselves; indeed, on the things themselves, not an attack on the Russian order of things, but on Russia itself. My Russian liberal goes as far as to reject Russia; that is, he hates and strikes his own mother. Every misfortune and mishap of the mother country fills him with mirth, and even with ecstasy. He hates the national customs, Russian history, and everything. If he has a justification, it is that he does not know what he is doing, and believes that his hatred of Russia is the grandest and most profitable kind of liberalism. You will often find a liberal who is applauded and esteemed by his fellows, but who is in reality the dreariest, blandest, dullest of conservatives, and is not aware of the fact. This hatred for Russia has been mistaken by some of our Russian liberals for sincere love of their country, and they boast that they see better than their neighbours what real love of one's country should consist in. But of late they have grown more candid, and are ashamed of the expression love of country, and have annihilated the very fact, the very spirit of the words, as something injurious and petty and undignified. This is the truth, and I hold by it. But at the same time, it is a phenomenon which has not been repeated at any other time or place, and therefore, though I hold to it as a fact, yet I recognize that it is an accidental phenomenon, and may likely enough to pass away. There can be no such thing anywhere else as a liberal who really hates his country. And how is this fact to be explained among us? By my original statement that a Russian liberal is not a Russian liberal. That's the only explanation that I can see." "I take all that you have said as a joke," said Prince S. seriously. "I have not seen all kinds of liberals, and cannot therefore set myself up as judge," said Alexandra. "But I have heard all you have said with indignation. You have taken some accidental case and twisted it into a universal law, which is unjust." "Accidental case?" said Evgenie Pavlovitch. "Do you consider it an accidental case, prince?" "I must also admit," said the prince, "that I have not seen much, or been very far into the question, but I cannot help thinking that you are more or less right, and that Russian liberalism, that phase of which you are considering at least, really is something inclined to hate Russia itself, and not only its existing order of things in general. Of course, this is only partially the truth; you cannot lay down the law for all." The prince blushed, and broke off without finishing what he meant to say. In spite of his shyness and agitation, he could not help being greatly interested in the conversation. A special characteristic of his was the naive candour with which he always listened to arguments which interested him, and with which he answered any question put to him on the subject at issue. In the very expression of his face was naivete. This naivete was unmistakably evident, this disbelief in the insincerity of others, and unsuspecting disregard of irony or humour in their words. But though Evgenie Pavlovitch had put this question to the prince with no other purpose but to enjoy the joke of his simple-minded seriousness, yet now, at his answer, he was surprised into some seriousness himself, and looked gravely at Myshkin as though he had not expected that sort of answer at all. "Why, how strange!" he ejaculated. "You did not answer me seriously, surely, did you?" Did you not ask me the question seriously?" inquired the prince in amazement. Everybody laughed. "Oh, trust him for that," said Adelaida. "Evgenie Pavlovitch turns everything and everybody he can lay hold of to ridicule. You should hear the things he says sometimes, apparently in perfect seriousness." "In my opinion, the conversation has been a painful one throughout, and we ought never to have begun it," said Alexandra. "We were all going for a walk." "Come along, then," said Evgenie. "It's a glorious evening. But to prove that this time I was speaking absolutely seriously, and especially to prove this to the prince—for you, prince, have interested me exceedingly, and I swear to you that I'm not quite such an ass as I like to appear sometimes, though I am rather an ass, I admit it. And, well, ladies and gentlemen, will you allow me just to put one more question to the prince out of pure curiosity? It shall be the last. This question came into my mind a couple of hours since. You see, prince, I do think seriously at times, and I made my own decision upon it. Now I wish to hear what the prince will say to it. We have just used the expression 'accidental case.' This is a significant phrase, we often hear it. Well, not long since everyone was talking and reading about that terrible murder of 6 people on the part of a young fellow, and of the extraordinary speech of the counsel for the evidence, who observed that in the poverty-stricken condition of the criminal, it must have come naturally into his head to kill these 6 people. I do not quote his words, but that is the sense of them, or something very like it. Now, in my opinion, the barrister who put forward this extraordinary plea was probably absolutely convinced that he was starting the most liberal, the most humane, and the most enlightened view of the case that could possibly be brought forward in these days. Now, was this distortion, this capacity for a perverted way of viewing things, a special or accidental case, or is it such a general rule?" Everybody laughed at this. "A special case! Accidental, of course!" cried Alexandra and Adelaida. "Let me remind you once more, Evgenie," said the prince, "that your joke is getting a little threadbare." "What do you think about it, prince?" asked Evgenie, taking no notice of the last remark, and observing Myshkin's serious eyes fixed upon his face. "What do you think? Was it a special or a usual case, the rule or an exception? I confess I put the question especially for you." "No, I don't think it was a special case," said the prince, quietly but firmly. "My dear fellow," said Prince S. with some annoyance, "don't you see that he is chaffing you? He is simply laughing at you, and wants to make game of you." "I thought Evgenie Pavlovitch was talking seriously," said the prince, blushing and dropping his eyes. "My dear prince," continued Prince S., "remember what you and I were saying 2 or 3 months ago. We spoke of the fact that in our newly opened law courts one could already lay one's finger upon so many talented and remarkable young barristers. How pleased you were with the state of things as we found it, and how glad I was to observe your delight. You both said it was a matter to be proud of, but this clumsy defense that Evgenie mentions, this strange argument, can, of course, only be an accidental case, one in 1,000." The prince reflected a little, but very soon he replied, with absolute conviction in his tone, though he still spoke somewhat shyly and timidly. "I only wish to say that this distortion, as Evgenie Pavlovitch expressed it, is met with very often, and is far more the general rule than the exception, unfortunately for Russia. So much so that if this distortion were not the general rule, perhaps these dreadful crimes would be less frequent." "Dreadful crimes! But I can assure you that crimes just as dreadful, and probably more horrible, have occurred before our times, and at all times, and not only here in Russia, but everywhere else as well. And in my opinion it is not at all likely that such murders will cease to occur for a very long time to come. The only difference is that in former times there was less publicity, while now everyone talks and writes freely about such things, which fact gives the impression that such crimes have only now sprung into existence. That is where your mistake lies, an extremely natural mistake, I assure you, my dear fellow," said Prince S. "I know that there were just as many and just as terrible crimes before our times. Not long since I visited a convict prison, and made acquaintance with some of the criminals. There were some even more dreadful criminals than this one we have been speaking of, men who have murdered a dozen of their fellow creatures, and feel no remorse whatsoever. But what I especially noticed was this, that the very most hopeless and remorseless murderer, however hardened a criminal he may be, still knows that he is a criminal, that he is conscious that he has acted wickedly, though he may feel no remorse whatever. And they were all like this. Those of whom Evgenie Pavlovitch has spoken do not admit that they are criminals at all. They think they had a right to do what they did, and that they were even doing a good deed. Perhaps. I consider there is the greatest difference between the two cases. And recollect, it was a youth, at the particular age which is most helplessly susceptible to the distortion of ideas." Prince S. was now no longer smiling. He gazed at the prince in bewilderment. Alexandra, who had seemed to wish to put in her word when the prince began, now sat silent, as though some sudden thought had caused her to change her mind without speaking. Evgenie Pavlovitch gazed at him in real surprise, and this time his expression of face had no mockery in it whatever. "What are you looking so surprised about, my friend?" asked Mrs. Epanchin suddenly. "Did you suppose he was stupider than yourself, and was incapable of forming his own opinions, or what?" "No, oh no, not at all," said Evgenie. "But how is it, prince, that you—excuse the question, will you?—if you are capable of observing and seeing things as you evidently do, how is it that you saw nothing distorted or perverted in that claim upon your property which you acknowledged a day or two since, and which was full of arguments founded upon the most distorted views of right and wrong?" "I tell you what, my friend," cried Mrs. Epanchin of a sudden, "here are we, all sitting here and imagining we are very clever, and perhaps laughing at the prince, some of us, and meanwhile he has received a letter this very day in which that same Clement renounces his claim and begs the prince's pardon. We don't often get that sort of letter, and yet we are not ashamed to walk with our noses in the air before him." "And Hippolyte has come down here to stay," said Colia suddenly. "What? Has he arrived?" said the prince, starting up. "Yes, I brought him down from town just after you had left the house." "There now, it's just like him!" cried Lizabetha Prokofievna, boiling over once more, and entirely oblivious of the fact that she had taken the prince's part. "I dare swear that you went up to town yesterday on purpose to get the little wretch to do you the great honour of coming to stay at your house. You did go up to town, you know you did, and you said so yourself. Now then, did you or did you not go down on your knees and beg him to come? Confess!" "No, he didn't, for I saw it all myself," said Colia. "On the contrary, Hippolyte kissed his hand twice and thanked him, and all the prince said was that he thought Hippolyte might feel better here in the country." "Don't, Colia! What is the use of saying all that?" cried the prince, rising and taking his hat. "Where are you going now?" "Never mind about him now, prince," said Colia. "He is all right, and taking a nap after the journey. He is very happy to be here, but I think perhaps it would be better if you let him alone for today. He is very sensitive now that he is so ill, and he might be embarrassed if you show him too much attention at first. He is decidedly better today, and says he has not felt so well for the last 6 months, and has coughed much less too." The prince observed that Aglaya came out of her corner and approached the table at this point. He did not dare to look at her, but he was conscious to the very tip of his fingers that she was gazing at him, perhaps angrily, and she had probably flushed up with a look of fiery indignation in her black eyes. "It seems to me, Colia, that you were very foolish to bring your young friend down, if he is the same consumptive boy who wept so profusely and invited us all to his own funeral," remarked Evgenie. "He talked so eloquently about the blank wall outside his bedroom window, and I am sure he will never support life here without it." "I think so too," said Mrs. Epanchin. "He will quarrel with you and be off." And she drew her work-box towards her with an air of dignity, quite oblivious of the fact that the family was about to start for a walk in the park. "Yes, I remember he boasted about the blank wall in an extraordinary way," continued Evgenie. "And I feel that without that blank wall he will never be able to die eloquently, and he does so long to die eloquently." "Oh, you must forgive him the blank wall," said the prince quietly. "He has come down to see a few trees now, poor fellow." "Oh, I forgive him with all my heart. You may tell him so if you like," laughed Evgenie. "I don't think you should take it quite like that," said the prince quietly, and without removing his eyes from the carpet. "I think it is more a case of his forgiving you." "Forgiving me? Why so? What have I done to need his forgiveness?" "If you don't understand, then—" "But of course you understand. He wished to bless you all around, and to have your blessing before he died. That is all." "My dear prince," began Prince S. hurriedly, exchanging glances with some of those present, "you will not easily find heaven on earth, and yet you seem to expect to. Heaven is a difficult thing to find anywhere, prince, far more difficult than appears to that good heart of yours. Better stop this conversation, or we shall all be growing quite disturbed in our minds, and—" "Let's go and hear the band, then," said Lizabetha Prokofievna angrily, rising from her place. The rest of the company followed her example. End of chapter 1. Part 3. Chapter 2, Part 3 of The Idiot, by Fyodor Dostoevsky, translated by Eva M. Martin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Ali Makki. Chapter 2. The prince suddenly approached Evgenie Pavlovitch. "Evgenie Pavlovitch," he said with strange excitement, and seizing the latter's hand in his own, "be assured that I esteem you as a generous and honourable man, in spite of everything. Be assured of that." Evgenie Pavlovitch fell back a step in astonishment. For one moment it was all he could do to restrain himself from bursting out laughing, but looking closer he observed that the prince did not seem to be quite himself. At all events he was in a very curious state. "I wouldn't mind betting, prince," he cried, "that you did not in the least mean to say that, and very likely you meant to address someone else altogether. What is it? Are you feeling unwell or anything?" "Very likely, extremely likely. And you must be a very close observer to detect the fact that perhaps I did not intend to come up to you at all." So saying, he smiled strangely, but suddenly and excitedly he began again. "Don't remind me of what I have done or said, don't! I am very much ashamed of myself.
Why, what have you done? I don't understand you."
I see you are ashamed of me, Evgenie Pavlovitch. You are blushing for me. That's a sign of a good heart. Don't be afraid. I shall go away directly."
"What is the matter with him?
"Do his fits begin like that?" said Lizabetha Prokofievna in a high state of alarm, addressing Colia. "No, no, Lizabetha Prokofievna, take no notice of me. I am not going to have a fit. I will go away directly, but I know I am afflicted. I was 24 years an invalid, you see, the first 24 years of my life. So take all I do and say as the sayings and actions of an invalid. I'm going away directly, I really am. Don't be afraid, I'm not blushing, for I don't think I need blush about it, need I? But I see that I am out of place in society. Society is better without me. It's not vanity, I assure you. I have thought over it all these last 3 days, and I have made up my mind that I ought to unbosom myself candidly before you at the first opportunity. There are certain things, certain great ideas, which I must not so much as approach, as Prince S. has just reminded me, or I shall make you all laugh. I have no sense of proportion, I know. My words and gestures do not express my ideas. They are a humiliation, an abasement of the ideas, and therefore I have no right. And I am too sensitive. Still, I believe I am beloved in this household, and esteemed far more than I deserve. But I can't help knowing that after 24 years of illness there must be some trace left, so that it is impossible for people to refrain from laughing at me sometimes. Don't you think so?" He seemed to pause for a reply, for some verdict as it were, and looked humbly around him. All present stood rooted to the earth with amazement at his unexpected and apparently uncalled for outbreak. But the poor prince's painful and rambling speech gave rise to a strange episode. "Why do you say all this here?" cried Aglaya, suddenly. "Why do you talk like this to them?" She appeared to be in the last stages of wrath and irritation. Her eyes flashed. The prince stood dumbly and blindedly before her, and suddenly grew pale. "There is not one of them all who is worthy of these words of yours," continued Aglaya. "Not one of them is worth your little fingers. Not one of them has heart or head to compare with yours. You are more honest than all, and better, nobler, kinder, wiser than all. There are some here who are unworthy to bend and pick up the handkerchief you have just dropped. Why do you humiliate yourself like this, and place yourself lower than these people? Why do you debase yourself before them? Why have you no pride?" "My God, who would have believed this?" cried Mrs. Epanchin, wringing her hands. "Hurrah for the poor knight!" cried Colia. "Be quiet! How dare they laugh at me in your house?" said Aglaya, turning sharply on her mother in that hysterical frame of mind that rides recklessly over every obstacle and plunges blindly through proprieties. "Why does everyone worry and torment me? Why have they all been bullying me these 3 days about you, prince? I will not marry you, never, and under no circumstances. Know that once and for all. As if anyone could marry an absurd creature like you! Just look in the glass and see what you look like this very moment. Why do they torment me and say I am going to marry you? You must know it, you are in the plot with them." "No one ever tormented you on the subject," murmured Adelaida, aghast. "No one ever thought of such a thing! There has never been a word said about it!" cried Alexandra. "And who has been annoying her? Who has been tormenting the child? Who could have said such a thing to her? Is she raving?" cried Lizabetha Prokofievna, trembling with rage, to the company in general. "Every one of them has been saying it, every one of them, all these 3 days, and I will never, never marry him." So saying, Aglaya burst into bitter tears, and hiding her face in her handkerchief, sank back into a chair.
"But he has never even—"
"I have never asked you to marry me, Aglaya Ivanovna," said the prince of a sudden.
"What's that?"
cried Mrs. Epanchin, raising her hands in horror. She could not believe her ears. "I meant to say—I only meant to say," said the prince, faltering. "I merely meant to explain to Aglaya Ivanovna, to have the honour to explain, as it were, that I had no intention, never had, to ask the honour of her hand. I assure you I am not guilty, Aglaya Ivanovna, I am not, indeed. I never did wish to, I never thought of it at all, and never shall. You'll see it yourself, you may be quite assured of it. Some wicked person has been maligning me to you, but it's all right. Don't worry about it." So saying, the prince approached Aglaya. She took the handkerchief from her face, glanced keenly at him, took in what he had said, and burst out laughing. Such a merry and unrestrained laugh, so hearty and gay, that Adelaida could not contain herself. She too glanced at the prince's panic-stricken countenance, and then rushed at her sister, threw her arms around her neck, and burst into as merry a fit of laughter as Aglaya's own. They laughed together like a couple of schoolgirls. Hearing and seeing this, the prince smiled happily, and in accents of relief and joy he exclaimed, "Well, thank God, thank God!" Alexandra now joined in, and it looked as though the three sisters were going to laugh on forever. "They are insane," muttered Lizabetha Prokofievna. "Either they frighten one out of each other's wits, or else—" But Prince S. was laughing now too. So was Evgenie Pavlovitch, so was Colia, and so was the prince himself, who caught the infection as he looked round radiantly upon the others. "Come along, let's go out for a walk," cried Adelaida. "We'll all go together, and the prince must absolutely go with us. You needn't go away, you dear good fellow. Isn't he a dear, Aglaya? Isn't he, mother? I must really give him a kiss for his explanations to Aglaya just now. Mother dear, may I kiss him? Mayn't I? Aglaya, may I kiss your prince?" cried the young rogue, and sure enough she skipped up to the prince and kissed his forehead. He seized her hands and pressed them so hard that Adelaida nearly cried out. He then gazed with delight into her eyes, and raising her right hand to his lips with enthusiasm, kissed it 3 times. "Come along," said Aglaya. "Prince, you must walk with me. May he, mother? This young cavalier who won't have me. You said you would never have me, didn't you, prince? No, no, no! No, not like that. That's not the way you give your arm. Don't you know how to give your arm to a lady yet? There, so! Now, come along. You and I will lead the way. Would you like to lead the way with me alone, tête-à-tête?" She went on talking and chatting without a pause, with occasional little bursts of laughter between. "Thank God, thank God!" said Lizabetha Prokofievna to herself, without quite knowing why she felt so relieved. "What an extraordinary people they are!" thought Prince S., for perhaps the 100th time since he had entered into the intimate relations with the family. But he liked these extraordinary people all the same. As for Prince Lef Nicolaievitch himself, Prince S. did not seem quite to like him somehow. He was decidedly preoccupied and a little disturbed as they all started off. Evgenie Pavlovitch seemed to be in a lively humour. He made Adelaida and Alexandra laugh all the way to the Vauxhall, But they both laughed so very really and promptly that the worthy Evgenie began at least to suspect that they were not listening to him at all. At this idea he burst out laughing all at once, in quite unaffected mirth, and without giving any explanation. The sisters, who also appeared to be in high spirits, never tired of glancing at Aglaya and the prince, who were walking in front. It was evident that their young sister was a thorough prize to them both. Prince S. tried hard to get up a conversation with Mrs. Epanchin upon outside subjects, probably with the good intention of distracting and amusing her, but he bored her dreadfully. She was absent-minded to a degree, and answered at cross purposes, and sometimes not at all. But the puzzle and mystery of Aglaya was not yet over for the evening. The last exhibition fell to the lot of the prince alone. When they had proceeded some 100 paces or so from the house, Aglaya said to her obstinately silent cavalier in a quick half-whisper,
Look to the right.
The prince glanced in the direction indicated.
Look closer. Do you see that bench in the park there, just by those 3 big trees? That green bench?
The prince replied that he saw it.
Do you like the position of it? Sometimes of a morning, early at 7 o'clock, when all the rest are still asleep, I come out and sit there alone.
The prince muttered that the spot was a lovely one.
Now, go away. I don't wish to have your arm any longer, or perhaps better continue to give me your arm and walk along beside me, but don't speak a word to me. I wish to think by myself.
The warning was certainly unnecessary, for the prince would not have said a word all the rest of the time, whether forbidden to speak or not. His heart beat loudly and painfully when Aglaya spoke of the bench. Could she— But no, he banished the thought after an instant's deliberation. At Pavlovsk, on weekdays, the public is more select than it is on Sundays and Saturdays, when the town folks come down to the walkabout and enjoy the park. The ladies dress elegantly on these days, and it is the best fashion to gather round the band, which is probably the best of our pleasure garden bands, and plays the newest pieces. The behaviour of the public is most correct and proper, and there is an appearance of friendly intimacy among the usual frequenters. Many come from nothing but to look at their acquaintances, but there are others who come for the sake of the music. It is very seldom that anything happens to break the harmony of the proceedings, though, of course, accidents will happen everywhere. On this particular evening the weather was lovely, and there was a large number of people present. All the places anywhere near the orchestra were occupied. Our friends took the chairs near the side exit. The crowd and the music cheered Mrs. Epanchin a little, and amused the girls. They bowed and shook hands with some of their friends, and nodded at a distance to others. They examined the ladies' dresses, noticed the comicalities and eccentricities among the people, and laughed and talked among themselves. Evgenie Pavlovitch, too, found plenty of friends to bow to. Several people noticed Aglaya and the prince, who were still together. Before very long, 2 or 3 young men had come up, and 1 or 2 remained to talk. All of these young men appeared to be on intimate terms with Evgenie Pavlovitch. Among them was a young officer, a remarkably handsome fellow, very good-natured, and a great chatterbox. He tried to get up a conversation with Aglaya, and did his best to secure her attention. Aglaya behaved very graciously to him, and chatted and laughed merrily. Evgenie Pavlovitch begged the prince's leave to introduce their friend to him. The prince hardly realized what was wanted of him, but the introduction came off. The 2 men bowed and shook hands. Evgenie Pavlovitch's friend asked the prince some questions, but the latter did not reply, or if he did, he muttered something so strangely indistinct that there was nothing to be made of it. The officer stared intently at him, and then glanced at Evgenie, divined why the latter had introduced him, and gave his undivided attention to Aglaya again. Only Evgenie observed that Aglaya flushed up for a moment at this. The prince did not notice that others were talking and making themselves agreeable to Aglaya. In fact, at moments he almost forgot that he was sitting by her himself. At other moments he felt a longing to go away somewhere and be alone with his thoughts, and to feel that no one knew where he was. Or if that were impossible, he would like to be alone at home, on the terrace, without either Lebedeff or his children, or anyone else about him, and to lie there and think, a day and night and another day again. He thought of the mountains, and especially of a certain spot which he used to frequent, whence he would look down upon the distant valleys and fields, and see the waterfall far off like a little silver thread, and the old ruined castle in the distance. Oh, how he longed to be there now, along with his thoughts! To think of one thing all his life, one thing! 1,000 years would not be too much time, and let everyone here forget him utterly. How much better it would have been if they had never known him, if all this could be but proved to be a dream. Perhaps it was a dream. Now and then he looked at Aglaya for 5 minutes at a time without taking his eyes off her face, but his expression was very strange. He would gaze at her as though she were an object a couple of miles distant, or as though he were looking at her portrait, and not at herself at all. "Why do you keep looking at me like that, prince?" she asked suddenly, breaking off her merry conversation and laughter with those about her. "I'm afraid of you. You look as though you were just going to put out your hand and touch my face to see if it's real. Doesn't he, Evgenie Pavlovitch? Doesn't he look like that?" The prince seemed surprised that he would have been addressed at all. He reflected a moment, but did not seem to take in what had been said to him. At all events, he did not answer, but observing that she and the others had begun to laugh, he too opened his mouth and laughed with them. The laughter became general, and the young officer, who seemed a particularly lively sort of person, simply shook with mirth. Aglaya suddenly whispered angrily to herself the word "idiot." "My goodness! Surely she is not in love with such a... surely she isn't mad!" groaned Mrs. Epanchin under her breath. "It's all a joke, mamma. It's just a joke like the other poor knight, nothing more whatever, I assure you," Alexandra whispered in her ear. "She's chaffing him, making a fool of him after her own private fashion, that's all. But she carries it just a little too far. She is a regular little actress. How she frightened us just now, didn't she? And all for a lark." "Well, it's lucky she has happened upon an idiot, then, that's all I can say," whispered Elizabetha Prokofievna, who was somewhat comforted, however, by her daughter's remark. The prince had heard himself referred to as an idiot, and had shuddered at the moment. But his shudder, it so happened, was not caused by the word applied to him. The fact was that in the crowd, not far from where Li was sitting, a pale familiar face with curly black hair and a well-known smile and expression had flashed across his vision for a moment and disappeared again. Very likely he had imagined it. There only remained to him the impression of a strange smile, 2 eyes, and a bright green tie. Whether the man had disappeared among the crowd, or whether he had turned towards the Vauxhall, the prince could not say. But a moment or two afterwards he began to glance keenly about him. That first vision might only too likely be the forerunner of a second. It was almost certain to be so. Surely he had not forgotten the possibility of such a meeting when he came to the Vauxhall. True enough, he had not remarked where he was coming to when he set out with Aglaya. He had not been in a condition to remark about anything at all. Had he been more careful to observe his companion, he would have seen that for the last quarter of an hour Aglaya had also been glancing around in apparent anxiety, as though she expected to see someone or something particular among the crowd of people. Now, at the moment when his own anxiety became so marked, her excitement also increased visibly, and when he looked about him, she did the same. The reason of their anxiety soon became apparent. From that very side entrance to the Vauxhall, near which the prince and all the Epanchin party were seated, there suddenly appeared quite a large knot of persons, at least a dozen. Heading this little band walked 3 ladies, 2 of whom were remarkably lovely, and there was nothing surprising in the fact that they should have had a large troop of admirers following in their wake. But there was something in the appearance of both the ladies and their admirers which was peculiar, quite different from that of the rest of the public assembled around the orchestra. Nearly everyone observed the little band advancing, and all pretended not to see or notice them, except for a few young fellows who exchanged glances and smiled, saying something to one another in whispers. It was impossible to avoid noticing them, however, in reality, for they made their presence only too conspicuous by laughing and talking loudly. It was to be supposed that some of them were more than half drunk, although they were well enough dressed, some even particularly well. There were 1 or 2, however, who were very strange-looking creatures, with flushed faces and extraordinary clothes. Some were military men, not all were quite young. 1 or 2 were middle-aged gentlemen of decidedly disagreeable appearances, men who are avoided in society like the plague. decked out in large gold studs and rings, and magnificently got up generally. Among our suburban resorts there are some which enjoy a specially high reputation for respectability and fashion, but the most careful individual is not absolutely exempt from the dangers of a tile falling suddenly upon his head from his neighbour's roof. Such a tile was about to descend upon the elegant and decorous public, now assembled to hear the music. In order to pass from the Vauxhall to the bandstand, the visitor had to descend 2 or 3 steps. Just at these steps the group paused, as though it feared to proceed further. But very quickly one of the 3 ladies who formed its apex stepped forward into the charmed circle, followed by 2 members of her suite. One of these was a middle-aged man of very respectable appearance, but with a stamp of parvenu upon him, a man whom nobody knew, and who evidently knew everybody. The other follower was a younger, and far less respectable looking. No one else followed the eccentric lady, but as she descended the steps, she did not even look behind her, as though it were absolutely the same to her whether anyone were following or not. She laughed and talked loudly, however, just as before. She was dressed with great taste, but perhaps with rather more magnificence than was needed for the occasion. She walked past an orchestra to where an open carriage was waiting near the road. The prince had not seen her for more than 3 months. All these days, since his arrival from Petersburg, he had intended to pay her a visit, but some mysterious presentiment had restrained him. He could not picture to himself what impression this meeting with her would make upon him, though he had often tried to imagine it with fear and trembling. One fact was quite certain, and that was that the meeting would be painful. Several times during the last 6 months he had recalled the effect which the first sight of this face had had upon him, when he only saw its portrait. He recollected well that even the portrait face had left but too painful an impression. That month in the provinces, when he had seen this woman nearly every day, had affected him so deeply that he could not now look back upon it calmly. In the very look of this woman there was something which tortured him. In conversation with Rogojin, he had attributed this sensation to pity, immeasurable pity, and this was the truth. The sight of the portrait face alone had filled his heart full of the agony of real sympathy, and this feeling of sympathy, nay, of actual suffering for her, had never left his heart since that hour, and was still in full force. Oh yes, more powerful than ever. But the prince was not satisfied with what he had said to Rogojin. Only at this moment, when she suddenly made her appearance before him, did he realize to the full the exact emotion which she called up in him, and which he had not described correctly to Rogojin. And indeed there were no words in which he could have expressed his horror, yes, horror, for he was now fully convinced, from his own private knowledge of her, that the woman was mad. If, loving a woman above everything in the world, or at least having a foretaste of the possibility of such love for her, one were suddenly to behold her on a chain, behind bars, and under the lash of a keeper, one would feel something like what the poor prince now felt. "What's the matter?" asked Aglaya in a whisper, giving his sleeve a little tug. He turned his head towards her and glanced at her black and for some reason flashing eyes, turned to smile, and then, apparently forgetting her in an instant, turned to the right once more and continued to watch the startling apparition before him. Nastasia Philipovna was at this moment passing the young ladies' chairs. Evgenie Pavlovitch continued some apparently extremely funny and interesting anecdote to Alexandra, speaking quickly and with much animation. The prince remembered that this moment Aglaya remarked in half a whisper, "What a—" She did not finish her indefinite sentence. She restrained herself in a moment, but it was enough. Nastasia Philipovna, who up to now had been walking along as though she had not noticed the Epanchin party, suddenly turned her head in their direction, as though she had just observed Evgenie Pavlovitch sitting there for the first time. "Why, I declare, here he is!" she cried, stopping suddenly. "The man one can't find, with all one's messengers sent about the place, sitting just under one's nose, exactly where one never thought of looking. I thought you were sure to be at your uncle's by this time." Evgenie Pavlovitch flushed up and looked angrily at Nastasia Philipovna, then turned his back on her.
What? Don't you know about it yet? He doesn't know, imagine that! Why, he's shot himself! Your uncle shot himself this very morning. I was told at 2 this afternoon. Half the town must know about it by now. They say there are 350,000 roubles, government money, missing. Some say 500,000. And I was under the impression that he would leave you a fortune. He whistled it all away. A most depraved old man, really. Well, ta-ta, bon chance. Surely you intend to be off there, don't you? Ha ha ha! You've retired from the army in a good time, I see. Plain clothes. Well done, sly rogue. Nonsense, I see you. You knew it all before. I dare say you knew all about it yesterday.
Although the impudence of this attack, this public proclamation of intimacy, as it were, was doubtless premeditated, and had its special object, yet Evgenie Pavlovitch at first seemed to intend to make no show of observing either his tormentor or her words. But Nastasia's communication struck him with the force of a thunderclap. On hearing of his uncle's death, he suddenly grew as white as sheet, and turned towards his informant. At this moment, Lizabetha Prokofievna rose swiftly from her seat, beckoned her companions, and left the place almost at a run. Only the prince stopped behind for a moment, as though in indecision, and Evgenie Pavlovitch lingered too, for he had not collected his scattered wits. But the Epanchins had not had the time to get more than 20 paces away when a scandalous episode occurred. The young officer, Evgenie Pavlovitch's friend, who had been conversing with Aglaya, said aloud in a great state of indignation: "She ought to be whipped! That's the only way to deal with creatures like that. She ought to be whipped!" This gentleman was a confidant of Evgenie's, and had doubtless heard of the carriage episode. Nastasia turned to him, her eyes flashed. She rushed up to a young man standing near, whom she did not know in the least, but who happened to have in his hand a thin cane. Seizing this from him, she brought it with all her force across the face of her insulter. All this occurred, of course, in one instant of time. The young officer, forgetting himself, sprang towards her. Nastasia's followers were not by her at the moment, the elderly gentleman having disappeared altogether, and the younger man simply standing aside and roaring with laughter. In another moment, of course, the police would have been on the spot, and it would have gone hard with Nastasia Philipovna had not unexpected aid appeared. Myshkin, who was but a couple of steps away, had time to spring forward and seize the officer's arm from behind. The officer, tearing himself from the prince's grasp, pushed him so violently backwards that he staggered a few steps and then subsided into a chair. But there were other defenders for Nastasia on the spot by this time. The gentleman known as the boxer now confronted the enraged officer. "Keller is my name, sir, ex-lieutenant," he said very loudly. "If you will accept me as champion for the fair sex, I am at your disposal. English boxing has no secrets from me. I sympathize with you for the insult you have received, but I can't permit you to raise your hand against a woman in public. If you prefer to meet me, as would be more fitting to your rank, in some other manner, of course you would understand me, captain." But the young officer had recovered himself, and was no longer listening. At this moment Rogojin appeared, elbowing through the crowd. He took Nastasia's hand, drew it through his arm, and quickly led her away. He appeared to be terribly excited. He was trembling all over, and was as pale as corpse. As he carried Nastasia off, he turned and grinned horribly in the officer's face, and with low malice observed: "Look what the fellow got! Look at the blood on his cheek! Recollecting himself, however, and seeing at a glance the sort of people he had to deal with, the officer turned his back on both his opponents, and courteously, but concealing his face with a handkerchief, approached the prince, who was now rising from the chair into which he had fallen. "Prince Myshkin, I believe? The gentleman to whom I had the honour of being introduced?" "She is mad, insane, I assure you she is mad," replied the prince in trembling tones, holding out both his hands mechanically towards the officer. "I cannot boast of any such knowledge, of course, but I wish to know your name." He bowed and retired without waiting for an answer. 5 seconds after the disappearance of the last actor in this scene, the police arrived. The whole episode had not lasted more than a couple of minutes. Some of the spectators had risen from their places and departed altogether. Some merely exchanged their seats for others a little further off. Some were delighted with the occurrence, and talked and laughed over it for a long time. In a word, the incident closed as such incidents do, and the band began to play again. The prince walked away after the Epanchin party. Had he thought of looking round to the left after he had been pushed unceremoniously into the chair, he would have observed Aglaya standing some 20 yards away. She had stayed to watch the scandalous scene, in spite of her mother's and sister's anxious cries to her to come away. Prince S. ran up to her and persuaded her at last to come home with them. Lizabetha Prokofievna saw that she returned in such a state of agitation that it was doubtful whether she had even heard their calls. But only a couple of minutes later, when they had reached the park, Aglaya suddenly remarked in her usual calm, indifferent voice, "I wanted to see how the farce would end." End of chapter 2, part 3. Chapter 3, Part 3 of The Idiot, by Fyodor Dostoevsky, translated by Eva M. Martin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Ali Maki. Chapter 3. The occurrence at the Vauxhall had filled both mother and daughters with something like horror. In their excitement, Lizabetha Prokofievna and the girls were nearly running all the way home. In her opinion, there was so much disclosed and laid bare by the episode that, in spite of the chaotic condition of her mind, she was able to feel more or less decided on certain points which up to now had been in a cloudy condition. However, one and all of the party realized that something important had happened, and that, perhaps fortunately enough, something which had hitherto been enveloped in the obscurity of guesswork had now begun to come forth a little from the mists. In spite of Prince S.'s assurances and explanations, Evgenie Pavlovitch's real character and position were at last coming to light. He was publicly convicted of intimacy with that creature, so thought Lizabetha Prokofievna and her 2 elder daughters. But the real upshot of the business was that the number of riddles to be solved was augmented. The 2 girls, though rather irritated at their mother's exaggerated alarm and haste to depart from the scene, had been unwilling to worry her at first with questions. Besides, they could not help thinking that their sister Aglaya probably knew more about the whole matter than both they and their mother put together. Prince S. looked as black as night and was silent and moody. Mrs. Epanchin did not say a word to him all the way home, and he did not seem to observe the fact. Adelaida tried to pump him a little by asking, who was the uncle they were talking about, and what was it that happened in Petersburg? But he had merely muttered something disconnected about making inquiries, and that, of course, it was all nonsense. Of course, replied Adelaida, and asked no more questions. Aglaya, too, was very quiet, and the only remark she made on the way home was that they were walking much too fast to be pleasant. Once she turned and observed the prince hurrying after them. Noticing his anxiety to catch them up, she smiled ironically and looked back no more. At length, just as they entered the house, General Epanchin came out and met them. He had only just arrived from town. His first word was to inquire after Evgenie Pavlovitch, but Lizabetha stalked past him, and neither looked at him nor answered his question. He immediately judged from the faces of his daughters and Prince S. that there was a thunderstorm brewing, and he himself already bore evidences of unusual perturbation of mind. He immediately buttonholed Prince S. and, standing at the front door, engaged in a whispered conversation with him. But the troubled aspect of both of them, when they entered the house and approached Mrs. Epanchin, it was evident that they had been discussing very disturbing news. Little by little the family gathered together upstairs in Lizabetha Prokofievna's apartments, and Prince Myshkin found himself alone on the veranda when he arrived. He settled himself in a corner and sat waiting, though he knew not what he expected. It never struck him that he had better go away, with all these disturbances in the house. He seemed to have forgotten all the world, and to be ready to sit on where he was for years on end.
From upstairs he caught sounds of excited conversation every now and then. He could not say how long he sat there. It grew late and became quite dark. Suddenly Aglaya entered the veranda. She seemed to be quite calm, though a little pale. Observing the prince, whom she evidently did not expect to see there alone in the corner, she smiled and approached him. "What are you doing there?" she asked. The prince muttered something, blushed, and jumped up, but Aglaya immediately sat down beside him, so he reseated himself. She looked suddenly but attentively into his face, then at the window as though thinking of something else, and then again at him. "Perhaps she wants to laugh at me," thought the prince, but no, for if she did she certainly would do so. "Would you like to come to tea? I'll order some," she said after a minute or two of silence. "No, thanks. I don't know." "Don't know? How can you not know? By the by, look here, if someone were to challenge you to a duel, what should you do? I wished to ask you this some time ago." "Why, nobody would ever challenge me to a duel." "But if they were to, would you be dreadfully frightened?" "I dare say I should be, much alarmed." "Seriously? Then are you a coward?" "No, I don't think so. A coward is a man who is afraid and runs away. The man who is frightened but does not run away is not quite a coward," said the prince with a smile, after a moment's thought. "And you wouldn't run away?" "No, I don't think I should run away," replied the prince, laughing outright at last at Aglaya's question. "Though I am a woman, I should certainly not run away from anything," said Aglaya, in a slightly pained voice. "However, I see you are laughing at me and twisting your face up as usual, in order to make yourself look more interesting. Now tell me, they generally shoot at 20 paces, don't they? At 10 sometimes? I suppose if at 10 they must be either wounded or killed, mustn't they? I don't think they often kill each other at duels." "They killed Pushkin that way." "That may have been an accident." "Not a bit of it. It was a duel to the death, and he was killed." "The bullet struck so low down that probably his antagonist would never have aimed at that part of him. People never do. He would have aimed at his chest or head, so that probably the bullet hit him accidentally. I have been told this by competent authorities." "Well, a soldier once told me that they were always ordered to aim at the middle of the body. So you see, they don't aim at the chest or head, they aim lower on purpose. I asked some officer about this afterwards, and he said it was perfectly true." "That is probably when they fire from a long distance." "Can you shoot at all?" "No, I have never shot in my life." "Can't you even load a pistol?" "No. That is, I understand how it's done, of course, but I have never done it." "Then you don't know how, for it is a matter that needs practice. Now listen and learn. In the first place, buy good powder, not damp. They say it mustn't be damp at all, but very dry. Some fine kind it is. You must ask for pistol powder, not the stuff they load cannons with. They say one makes the bullet oneself, somehow or other. Have you got a pistol?" "No, and I don't want one," said the prince, laughing. "Oh, what nonsense! You must buy one. French or English are the best, they say. Then take a little powder, about a thimbleful, or perhaps two, and pour it into the barrel. Better put plenty. Then push in a bit of felt. It must be felt for some reason or other. You can easily get a bit of some old mattresses or off a door. It's used to keep the cold out. Well, when you have pushed the felt down, put the bullet in. Do you hear now? The bullet last, and the powder first, not the other way, or the pistol won't shoot." "What are you laughing at? I wish you to buy a pistol and practice every day, and you must learn to hit a mark for certain. Will you?" The prince only laughed. Aglaya stamped her foot with annoyance. Her serious air, however, during this conversation had surprised him considerably. He had a feeling that he ought to be asking her something, that there was something he wanted to find out far more important than how to load a pistol. But his thoughts had all scattered, and he was only aware that she was sitting by him and talking to him, and that he was looking at her. As to what she happened to be saying to him, that did not matter in the least. The general now appeared on the veranda, coming from upstairs. He was on his way out, with an expression of determination on his face, and of preoccupation and worry also. "Ah, Lef Nicolaievitch, is that you, is it? Where are you off to now?" he asked, oblivious of the fact that the prince had not showed the least sign of moving. "Come along with me, I want to say a word or two to you." "Au revoir, then," said Aglaya, holding out her hand to the prince. It was quite dark now, and Myshkin could not see her face clearly, but a minute or two later, when he and the general had left the villa, he suddenly flushed up and squeezed his right hand tightly. It appeared that he and the general were going in the same direction. In spite of the lateness of the hour, the general was hurrying away to talk to someone upon some important subject. Meanwhile he talked incessantly but disconnectedly to the prince, and continually brought in the name of Lizabetha Prokofievna. If the prince had been in a condition to pay more attention to what the general was saying, he would have discovered that the latter was desirous of drawing some information out of him, or indeed of asking him some question outright, but that he could not make up his mind to come to the point. Myshkin was so absent that from the very first he could not attend to a word the other was saying, and when the general suddenly stopped before him with some excited question, he was obliged to confess ignominiously that he did not know in the least what he had been talking about. The general shrugged his shoulders. "How strange everyone, yourself included, has become of late," said he. "I was telling you that I cannot in the least understand Lizabetha Prokofievna's ideas and agitations. She is in hysterics up there, and moans and says that we have been shamed and disgraced. How? Why? When? By whom? I confess that I am very much to blame myself. I do not conceal the fact, but the conduct, the outrageous behavior of this woman must really be kept within limits by the police, if necessary, and I am just on my way now to talk the question over and make some arrangements. It can all be managed quietly and gently, even kindly, without the slightest fuss or scandal. I foresee that the future is pregnant with events, and that there is much that needs explanation. There is intrigue in the wind. But if on one side nothing is known, on the other side nothing will be explained. If I have heard nothing about it, nor have you, nor he, nor she, who has heard about it? I should like to know. How can all this be explained except by the fact that half of it's mirage or moonshine, or some hallucination of that sort?" "She is insane," muttered the prince, suddenly recollecting all that had passed, with a spasm of pain in his heart. "I too had that idea, and I slept in peace. But now I see that their opinion is more correct. I do not believe in the theory of madness. The woman has no common sense, but she is not only insane, she is artful to a degree. Her outburst of this evening about Evgenie's uncle proves that conclusively. It was villainous, simply Jesuitical. It was all for some special purpose." "What about Evgenie's uncle?" "My goodness, Lef Nicolaievitch! Why, you can't have heard a single word I said. Look at me, I'm still trembling all over from dreadful shock. It is that kept me in town so late. Evgenie Pavlovitch's uncle—" "Well?" cried the prince. "Shot himself this morning at 7 o'clock. A respected, eminent old man of 70, and exactly point for point as she described it. A sum of money, a considerable sum of the government's money, missing." "Why, how could she?" "What, know of it? Why, there was a whole crowd round her the moment she appeared on the scene here. You know what sort of people surround her nowadays, and solicit the honour of her acquaintance. Of course she might easily have heard the news from someone coming from town. All Petersburg, if not all Pavlovsk, knows it by now. Look at the slyness of her observation about Evgenie's uniform. I mean, her remark that he had retired just in time. There's a venomous hint for you, if you like. No, no, there's no insanity there. Of course I refuse to believe that Evgenie Pavlovitch could have known beforehand of the catastrophe, that at such and such day at 7 o'clock, and all that. But he might as well have had a presentiment of the truth, and all of us, Prince S. and everybody, believe that he was to inherit a large fortune from his uncle. It's dreadful, horrible. Mind, I don't suspect Evgenie of anything, be quite clear on that point, but the thing is a little suspicion nevertheless. Prince S. can't get over it. Altogether it is a very extraordinary combination of circumstances." "What suspicion attaches to Evgenie Pavlovitch?" "Oh, none at all. He has behaved very well indeed. I didn't mean to drop any sort of hint. His own fortune is intact, I believe. Lizabetha Prokofievna, of course, refuses to listen to anything. That is the worst of it all, these family catastrophe or quarrels, or whatever you like to call them. You know, prince, you are a friend of the family, so I don't mind telling you. It now appears that Evgenie Pavlovitch proposed to Aglaya a month ago, and was refused." "Impossible!" cried the prince. "Why? Do you know anything about it? Look here," continued the general, more agitated than ever and trembling with excitement. "Maybe I have been letting the cat out of the bag too freely with you. If so, it is because you are that sort of man, you know. Perhaps you have some special information?" "I know nothing about Evgenie Pavlovitch," said the prince. "Nor do I. They always try to bury me underground when there's something going on. They don't seem to reflect that it is unpleasant to a man to be treated so. I won't stand it. We have just had a terrible scene. Mind, I speak to you as I would to my own son. Aglaya laughs at her mother. Her sisters guessed about Evgenie having proposed and been rejected, and told Lizabetha. I tell you, my dear fellow, Aglaya is such an extraordinary, such a self-willed, fantastical little creature. You wouldn't believe it. Every high quality, every brilliant trait of heart and mind are to be found in her, and with it all, so much caprice and mockery, such wild fantasies indeed, a little devil! She has just been laughing at her mother to her very face, and at her sisters, and at Prince S. and everybody, and of course she always laughs at me. You know, I love the child. I love her even when she laughs at me, and I believe the little wild creature has special fondness for me for that very reason. She is fonder of me than any of the others. I dare swear she has a good laugh at you before now. You were having a quiet talk, I observed, after all the thunder and lightning upstairs. She was sitting with you just as though there had been no row at all." The prince blushed painfully in the darkness and closed his right hand tightly, but he said nothing. "My dear good Prince Lef Nicolaievitch," began the general again, "both I and Lizabetha Prokofievna, who has begun to respect you once more, and me through you, goodness knows why, we both love you very sincerely and esteem you in spite of any appearances to the contrary. But you'll admit what a riddle it must have been for us when that calm, cold little spitfire Aglaya—for she stood up to her mother and answered her questions with inexpressible contempt, and mine still more so, because like a fool I thought it my duty to assert myself as head of the family, when Aglaya stood up of a sudden and informed us that that mad woman, strangely enough she used exactly the same expression as you did, has taken it into her head to marry me to Prince Lef Nicolaievitch, and therefore is doing her best to choke Evgenie Pavlovitch off and rid the house of him. That's what she said. I would not give the slightest explanation. She burst out laughing, banged the door, and went away. We all stood there with our mouths open. Well, I was told afterwards of your little passage with Aglaya this afternoon, and dear prince, you are a good, sensible fellow. Don't be angry if I speak out. She is laughing at you, my boy. She is enjoying herself like a child, at your expense, and therefore, since she is a child, don't be angry with her, and don't think anything of it. I assure you she is simply making a fool of you, just as she does with one and all of us, out of pure lack for something better to do. Well, goodbye. You know our feelings, don't you? Our sincere feelings for you. They are unalterable, you must know, dear boy, under all circumstances. But, well, here we part. I must go down to the right. Rarely have I sat so uncomfortably in my saddle, as they say, as I now sit, and people talk of the charms of a country holiday." Left to himself at the cross-road, the prince glanced around him, quickly crossed the road towards the lighted windows of the neighbouring house, and unfolded a tiny scrap of paper which he had clasped in his right hand during the whole of his conversation with the general. He read the note in the uncertain rays that fell from the window. It was as follows: "Tomorrow morning I shall be at the green bench in the park at 7, and shall wait there for you. I have made up my mind to speak to you about a most important matter which closely concerns yourself. P.S. I trust that you will not show this note to anyone. Though I am ashamed of giving you such instructions, I feel that I must do so, considering what you are. I therefore write the words, and blush for your simple character. P.P.S. It is the same green bench that I showed you before. There, aren't you ashamed of yourself? I felt that it was necessary to repeat even that information." The note was written and folded anyhow, evidently in great hurry, and probably just before Aglaya had come down to the veranda. In inexpressible agitation, amounting almost to fear, the prince slipped quickly away from the window, away from the light, like a frightened thief. But as he did so, he collided violently with some gentleman who seemed to spring from the earth at his feet. "I was watching for you, prince," said the individual. "Is that you, Keller?" said the prince in surprise. "Yes, I have been looking for you. I waited for you at the Epanchin's house, but of course I could not come in. I dogged you from behind as you walked along the general. Well, prince, here is Keller, absolutely at your service. Command him, ready to sacrifice himself, even to die in case of need." "But why?" "Oh, why? Of course you'll be challenged. That was young Lieutenant Moloftsoff. I know him, or rather of him. He won't pass an insult. He will take no notice of Rogojin and myself, and therefore you are the only one left to account for. You'll have to pay the piper, prince. He has been asking about you, and undoubtedly his friend will call on you tomorrow. Perhaps he is at your house already. If you would do me the honor to have me for a second, prince, I should be happy. That's why I have been looking for you now." "Duel? You've come to talk about a duel too?" The prince burst out laughing, to the great astonishment of Keller. He laughed unrestrainedly, and Keller, who had been on pins and needles, and in a fever of excitement to offer himself as second, was very near being offended. "You caught him by the arms, you know, prince. No man of proper pride can stand that sort of treatment in public." "Yes, and he gave me a fearful dig in the chest," cried the prince, still laughing. "What are we to fight about? I shall beg his pardon, that's all. But if we must fight, we'll fight. Let him have a shot at me, by all means. I should rather like it. I know how to load a pistol now. Do you know how to load a pistol, Keller? First, you have to buy the powder, you know. It mustn't be wet, and it mustn't be that coarse stuff that they load cannons with. It must be a pistol powder. Then you pour the powder in, and get hold of a bit of felt from some door. Then shove the bullet in. But don't shove the bullet in before the powder, because the thing wouldn't go off. Do you hear, Keller? The thing wouldn't go off. Isn't that a grand reason, Keller, my friend, eh? Do you know, my dear fellow, I really must kiss you and embrace you this very moment. How was it that you so suddenly popped up in front of me as you did? Come to my house as soon as you can, and we'll have some champagne. We'll all get drunk. Do you know I have a dozen champagne in Lebedeff's cellar? Lebedeff sold them to me the day after I arrived. I took the lot. We'll invite everybody. Are you going to do any sleep tonight?" "As much as usual, prince. Why?" "Pleasant dreams, then." The prince crossed the road and disappeared into the park, leaving the astonished Keller in a state of ludicrous wonder. He had never before seen the prince in such a strange condition of mind, and could not have imagined the possibility of it. "Fever, probably," he said to himself, "for the man is all nerves, and this business has been a little too much for him. He is not afraid, that's clear. That sort never funks. Champagne. That was an interesting item of news, at all events. 12 bottles, dear me! That's a very respectable little stock indeed. I bet anything Lebedeff lent somebody money on deposit of his dozen of champagne. He's a nice fellow, is this prince. I like this sort of man. Well, I needn't be wasting time here. If it's a case of champagne, why, there's no time like the present." That the prince was almost in a fever was no more the truth. He wandered about the park for a long while, and at last came to himself in a lonely avenue. He was vaguely conscious that he had already paced this particular walk, from the large dark tree to the bench at the other end, about 100 yards altogether, at least 30 times backwards and forwards. As to recollecting what he had been thinking of all that time, he could not. He caught himself, however, indulging in one thought which made him roar with laughter, though there was nothing really to laugh at in it. He felt that he must laugh, and go on laughing. It struck him that the idea of a duel might not have occurred to Keller alone, but that his lesson in the art of pistol-loading might not have been altogether accidental. "Pooh! Nonsense!" he said to himself, struck by another thought of a sudden. "Why, she was immensely surprised to find me there on the veranda, and laughed and talked about tea. And yet she had this little note in her hand, therefore she must have known that I was waiting there. So why was she surprised?" He pulled the note out and kissed it, then paused and reflected. "How strange it all is, how strange!" he muttered, melancholy enough now. In moments of great joy he invariably felt a sensation of melancholy come over him, he could not tell why. He looked intently around him and wondered why he had come here. He was very tired. So he approached the bench and sat down on it. Around him was profound silence. The music in the Vauxhall was over. The park seemed quite empty, though it was not in reality later than half-past 11. It was a quiet, warm, clear night, a real Petersburg night of early June. But in the dense avenue where he was sitting, it was almost pitch dark. If anyone had come up at this moment and told him that he was in love, passionately in love, he would have rejected the idea with astonishment and perhaps with irritation. And if anyone had added that Aglaya's note was a love letter, and that it contained an appointment to a lovers' rendezvous, he would have blushed with shame for the speaker, and probably have challenged him to a duel. All this would have been perfectly sincere on his part. He had never for a moment entertained the idea of the possibility of this girl loving him, or even of such a thing as himself falling in love with her. The possibility of being loved himself, "a man like me," as he put it, he ranked among ridiculous suppositions. It appeared to him that it was simply a joke on Aglaya's part, if there really were anything in it at all. But that seemed to him quite natural. His preoccupation was caused by something different. As to the few words which the general had let slip about Aglaya laughing at everybody and at himself most of all, he entirely believed them. He did not feel the slightest sensation of offence. On the contrary, he was quite certain that it was as it should be. His whole thoughts were now as to the next early morning. He would sit by her on that little green bench and listen to how pistols were loaded, and look at her. He wanted nothing more. The question as to what she might have to say of special interest to himself occurred to him once or twice. He did not doubt for a moment that she really had some such subject of conversation in store, but so very little interested in the matter was he, that it did not strike him to wonder what it could be. The crunch of gravel on the path suddenly caused him to raise his head. A man, whose face it was difficult to see in the gloom, approached the bench and sat down beside him. The prince peered into his face and recognized the livid features of Rogojin. "I knew you'd be wandering about somewhere here. I didn't have to look for you very long," muttered the latter between his teeth. It was the first time that they had met since the encounter on the staircase at the hotel. Painfully surprised as he was at the sudden apparition of Rogojin, the prince for some little while was unable to collect his thoughts. Rogojin evidently saw and understood the impression he had made, and though he seemed more or less confused at first, yet he began talking with what looked like assumed ease and freedom. However, the prince soon changed his mind on this score, and thought that there was not only no affectation of indifference, but that Rogojin was not even particularly agitated. If there were a little apparent awkwardness, it was only in his words and gestures. The man could not change his heart. "How did you find me here?" asked the prince, for the sake of saying something. "Keller told me. I found him at your place, that you were in the park. Of course he is, I thought." "Why so?" asked the prince uneasily. Rogojin smiled, but did not explain. "I received your letter, Lef Nicolaievitch. What's the good of it all? It's no use, you know. I come to you from her. She bade me tell you that she must see you. She has something to say to you. She told me to find you today." "I'll come tomorrow. Now I'm going home. Are you coming to my house?" "Why should I? I've given you the message. Goodbye." "Won't you come?" asked the prince in a gentle voice. "What extraordinary man you are! I wonder at you." Rogojin laughed sarcastically. "Why do you hate me so?" asked the prince sadly. "You know yourself that all you suspected is quite unfounded. I felt you were still angry with me, though. Do you know why? Because you tried to kill me. That's why you can't shake off your wrath against me. I tell you that I only remember Parfen Rogojin, with whom I exchanged crosses and vowed brotherhood. I wrote you this in yesterday's letter, in order that you might forget all that madness on your part, and that you might not feel called to talk about it when we met. Why do you avoid me? Why do you hold your hand back from me? I tell you again, I consider all that has passed a delirium, an insane dream. I can understand all you did, and all you felt that day as if it were myself. What you were imagining was not the case, and could never be the case. Why then should there be any anger between us?"
"You don't know what anger is," laughed Rogojin, in reply to the prince's heated words. He had moved a pace or two away, and was hiding his hands behind him. "No, it is impossible for me to come to your house again," he added slowly.
"Why? Why do you hate me so much as all that?"
"I don't love you, Lef Nicolaievitch, and therefore what would be the use of my coming to see you? You're just like a child. You want a plaything, and it must be taken out and given you, and then you don't know how to work it. You're simply repeating all you said in your letter, and what's the use? Of course I believe every word you say. I know perfectly well that you neither did or ever can deceive me in any way, and yet I don't love you. You write that you've forgotten everything, and only can remember your brother Parfen, with whom you exchanged crosses, and that you don't remember anything about the Rogojin who aimed a knife at your throat. What do you know about my feelings, eh?" Rogojin laughed disagreeably. "Here you are, holding out your brotherly forgiveness to me for a thing that I have perhaps never repented of in the slightest degree. I did not think of it again all that evening. All my thoughts were centered on something else."
"Not think of it again? Of course you did!" cried the prince. "And I dare swear that you came straight away down here to Pavlovsk to listen to the music and dog her about in the crowd, and stare at her, just as you did today. There's nothing surprising in that. If you hadn't been in that condition of mind that you could think of nothing but one subject, you would probably have never raised your knife against me. I had a presentiment of what you would do that day, ever since I saw you first in the morning. Do you know yourself what you looked like? I knew you would try to murder me, even at the very moment when we exchanged crosses. What did you take me to your mother for? Did you think to stay your hand by doing so? Perhaps you did not put your thoughts into words, but you and I were thinking the same thing, or feeling the same thing looming over us at the same moment. What should you think of me now? If you had not raised your knife to me, the knife which God averted from my throat, I would have been guilty of suspecting you all the same, and you would have intended the murder all the same. Therefore we should have been mutually guilty in any case. Come, don't frown. You needn't laugh at me either. You say you haven't repented. Repented? You probably couldn't if you were to try. You dislike me too much for that. Why, if I were an angel of light, and as innocent before you as a babe, you would still loathe me if you believed that she loved me, instead of loving yourself. That's jealousy. That's the real jealousy. But do you know what I have been thinking out during this last week, Parfen? I'll tell you. What if she loves you now better than anyone? What if she torments you because she loves you, and in proportions to her love for you, so she torments you the more? She won't tell you this, of course. You must have eyes to see. Why do you suppose she consents to marry you? She must have a reason, and that reason she will tell you some day. Some women desire the kind of love you give her, and she is probably one of these. Your love and your wild nature impress her. Do you know that a woman is capable of driving a man crazy almost, with her cruelties and mockeries, and feels not one single pang of regret because she looks at him and says to herself, 'There, I'll torment this man nearly into his grave, and then, oh, how I'll compensate him for it all with my love!'" Rogojin listened to the end, and then burst out laughing. "Why, prince, I declare you must have had a taste of this sort of thing yourself, haven't you? I have heard of something of the kind, you know. Is it true?" "What can you have heard?" said the prince, stammering. Rogojin continued to laugh loudly. He had listened to the prince's speech with curiosity and some satisfaction. The speaker's impulsive warmth had surprised and even comforted him. "Why, I've not only heard of it, I see it for myself," he said. "When have you ever spoken like that before? It wasn't like yourself, prince. Why, if I hadn't heard this report about you, I should never have come all this way into the parks, at midnight too." "I don't understand you in the least, Parfen."
"Oh, she told me about it long ago, and tonight I saw for myself. I saw you at the music, you know, and whom you were sitting with. She swore to me yesterday and again today that you were madly in love with Aglaya Ivanovna, but that's all the same to me, prince.
and it's not my affair at all. For if you have ever ceased to love her, she has not ceased to love you. You know, of course she wants to marry you to that girl. She's sworn to it. She says to me, 'Until then I won't marry you. When they go to church, we'll go too, and not before.' What on earth does she mean by it? I don't know, I never did. Either she loves you without limits, or... Yet, if she loves you, why does she wish to marry you to another girl? She says, 'I want to see him happy,' which is to say, she loves you." "I wrote, and I say to you once more that she is not in her right mind," said the prince, who had listened with anguish to what Rogojin said. "Goodness, no! You may be wrong there. At all events, she named the day this evening, as we left the gardens. 'In 3 weeks,' says she, 'and perhaps sooner, we shall be married.' She swore to it, took off her cross and kissed it. So it all depends upon you now, prince, you see."
"That is all madness. What you say about me, Parfen, never can and never will be. Tomorrow I shall come and see you—"
"How can she be mad," Rogojin interrupted, "when she is sane enough for other people and only mad for you? How can she write letters to her if she is mad? If she were insane, they would observe it in her letters." "What letters?" said the prince, alarmed. "She writes to her, and the girl reads the letters. Haven't you heard? You are sure to hear. She's sure to show you the letters herself."
"I won't believe this!"
cried the prince. "Why, prince, you've only gone a few steps along this road, I perceive. You're evidently a mere beginner. Wait a bit. Before long, you'll have your own detectives. You'll watch day and night, and you'll know every little thing that goes on there. That is, if—"
"Drop that subject, Rogojin, and never mention it again. And listen, as I have sat here and talked and listened, it had suddenly struck me that tomorrow is my birthday. It must be about 12 o'clock now. Come home with me, do, and we'll see the day in. We'll have some wine, and you shall wish me—I don't know what, but you, especially you, must wish me a good wish, and I shall wish you a full happiness in return. Otherwise, hand me my cross back. You didn't return it to me the next day. Haven't you got it on now?"
"Yes, I have," said Rogojin.
"Come along then. I don't wish to meet my new year without you. My new life, I should say, for a new life is beginning for me. Do you know, Parfen, that a new life had begun for me?"
"I see for myself that it is so, and I shall tell her. But you are not quite yourself, Lef Nicolaievitch."
End of Chapter 3, Part 3.
Chapter 4, Part 3 of The Idiot, by Fyodor Dostoevsky, translated by Eva M. Martin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Ali Maki. The prince observed with great surprise, as he approached his villa accompanied by Rogojin, that a large number of people were assembled on his verandah, which was brilliantly lighted up. The company seemed merry, and were noisily laughing and talking, even quarrelling, to judge from the sounds. At all events, they were clearly enjoying themselves, and the prince observed further on closer investigation that all had been drinking champagne. To judge from the lively condition of some of the party, it was to be supposed that a considerable quantity of champagne had been consumed already. All the guests were known to the prince, but the curious part of the matter was that they had all arrived on the same evening, as though with one accord, although he had only himself recollected the fact that it was his birthday a few moments since. "You must have told somebody you were going to trot out the champagne, and that's why they're all come," muttered Rogojin, as the two entered the verandah. "We know all about that. You've only to whistle, and they come up in shoals," he continued, almost angrily. He was doubtless thinking of his own late experiences with his boon companions. All surrounded the prince with exclamations of welcome, and, on hearing that it was his birthday, with cries of congratulation and delight. Many of them were very noisy. The presence of certain of those in the room surprised the prince vastly, but the guest whose advent filled him with the greatest wonder, almost amounting to alarm, was Evgenie Pavlovitch. The prince could not believe his eyes when he beheld the latter, and could not help thinking that something was wrong. Lebedeff ran up promptly to explain the arrival of all these gentlemen. He was himself somewhat intoxicated, but the prince gathered from his long-winded periods that the party had assembled quite naturally and accidentally.
First of all, Hippolyte had arrived early in the evening, and feeling decidedly better, had determined to wait the prince on the verandah. There Lebedeff had joined him, and his household had followed, that is, his daughters and General Ivolgin. Burdovsky had brought Hippolyte, and stayed on with him. Gania and Ptitsin had dropped in accidentally later on. Then came Keller, and he and Colia insisted on having champagne. Evgenie Pavlovitch had only dropped in half an hour or so ago. Lebedeff had served the champagne readily. "My own, though, prince, my own, mind," he said. "And there'll be some supper later on. My daughter is getting it ready now. Come and sit down, prince. We are all waiting for you. We want you with us. Fancy what we have been discussing. You know the question to be or not to be, out of Hamlet, a contemporary theme, quite up to date. Mr. Hippolyte has been eloquent to a degree. He won't go to bed, but he has only drunk a little champagne, and that can't do him any harm. Come along, prince, and settle the question. Everyone is waiting for you, sighing for the light of your luminous intelligence." The prince noticed the sweet, welcoming look on Vera Lebedeff's face as she made her way towards him through the crowd. He held out his hand to her. She took it, blushing with delight, and wished him a happy life from that day forward. Then she ran off to the kitchen, where her presence was necessary to help in the preparation for supper. Before the prince's arrival she had spent some time on the terrace, listening eagerly to the conversation, though the visitors, mostly under the influence of wine, were discussing abstract subjects far beyond her comprehension. In the next room her younger sister lay on a wooden chest, sound asleep, with her mouth wide open. But the boy, Lebedeff's son, had taken up his position close beside Colia and Hippolyte, his face lit up with interest in the conversation of his father and the rest, to which he would willingly have listened for 10 hours at a stretch. "I have waited for you on purpose, and I am very glad to see you arrive so happy," said Hippolyte, when the prince came forward to press his hand, immediately after greeting Vera. "And how do you know that I am so happy?" "I can see it by your face. Say how do you do to the others, and come and sit down here quick. I've been waiting for you," he added, accentuating the fact that he had waited. On the prince's asking, "Will it not be injurious to you to sit out so late?" he replied that he could not believe that he had thought himself dying 3 days or so ago, for he never had felt better than this evening. Burdovsky next jumped up and explained that he had come in by accident, having escorted Hippolyte from town. He murmured that he was glad he had written nonsense in his letter, and then pressed the prince's hand warmly, and sat down again. The prince approached Evgenie Pavlovitch last of all. The latter immediately took his arm. "I have a couple of words to say to you," he began, "and those on a very important matter. Let's go aside for a minute or two." "Just a couple of words," whispered another voice in the prince's other ear, and another hand took his other arm. Myshkin turned, and to his great surprise observed a red, flushed face and a droll-looking figure, which he recognized at once as that of Ferdishenko. Goodness knows where he had turned up from. "Do you remember Ferdishenko?" he asked. "Where have you dropped from?" cried the prince. "He is sorry for his sins now, prince," cried Keller. "He did not want to let you know he was here. He was hidden over there in the corner. But he repents now. He feels his guilt." "Why? What has he done?" "I met him outside and brought him in. He's a gentleman who doesn't often allow his friends to see him of late, but he's sorry now." "Delighted, I'm sure. I'll come back directly, gentlemen. Sit down there with the others, please. Excuse me one moment," said the host, getting away with difficulty in order to follow Evgenie. "You are very gay here," began the latter, "and I have had quite a pleasant half hour while I waited for you. Now then, my dear Lef Nicolaievitch, this is what's the matter. I've arranged it all with Molofstov, and I have just come in to relieve your mind on that score. You need be under no apprehensions. He was very sensible, as he should be, of course, for I think he was entirely to blame himself." "What Molostov?" "The young fellow whose arms you held, don't you know? He was so wild with you that he was going to send a friend to you tomorrow morning." "What nonsense!" "Of course it is nonsense, and in nonsense it would have ended doubtless. But you know these fellows, they—" "Excuse me, but I think you must have something else that you wish to speak about, Evgenie Pavlovitch." "Oh, of course I have," said the other, laughing.
Tomorrow, very early in the morning, I must be off to town about this unfortunate business. My uncle, you know. Just imagine, my dear sir, it's all true, word for word, and of course everybody knew it excepting myself. And all this has been such a blow to me that I have not managed to call in at the Epanchins'. Tomorrow I shall not see them either, because I shall be in town. I may not be here for 3 days or more. In a word, my affairs are a little out of gear. But though my town business is of course most pressing, still I determined not to go away until I had seen you, and had a clear understanding with you upon certain points, and that without loss of time. I will wait now, if you will allow me, until the company departs. I may just as well, for I have nowhere else to go to, and I shall certainly not do any sleeping tonight. I'm far too excited. And finally, I must confess that, though I know it is bad form to pursue a man in this way, I have come to beg your friendship, my dear prince. You are an unusual sort of person. You don't lie at every step, as some men do. In fact, you don't lie at all. And there is a matter in which I need a true and sincere friend, for I really may claim to be among the number of bona fide unfortunates just now." He laughed again. "But the trouble is," said the prince, after a slight pause of reflection, "that goodness only knows when this party will break up. Hadn't we better stroll into the park? I'll excuse myself. There's no danger of their going away." "No, no, I have my reasons for wishing them not to suspect us of being engaged in any specially important conversation. There are gentry present who are a little too much interested in us. You are not aware of that, perhaps, prince? It will be a great deal better if they see that we are friendly just in an ordinary way. They'll all go in a couple of hours, and then I'll ask you to give me 20 minutes, half an hour at most." "By all means, I assure you I am delighted. You need not have entered into all these explanations. As for your remarks about friendship with me, thanks very much indeed. You must excuse my being a little absent this evening. Do you know, I cannot somehow be attentive to anything just now." I see," said Evgenie, smiling gently. His mirth seemed very near the surface this evening. "What do you see?" said the prince, startled. "I don't want you to suspect that I have simply come here to deceive you and pump information out of you," said Evgenie, still smiling, and without making any direct reply to the question. "Oh, but I haven't the slightest doubt that you did come to pump me," said the prince, laughing himself at last. "And I dare say you are quite prepared to deceive me too, so far as that goes. But what of that? I'm not afraid of you. Besides, you'll hardly believe it, I feel as though I really didn't care a scrap one way or the other, just now. And as you are a capital fellow, I am convinced of that. I dare say we really shall end by being good friends. I like you very much, Evgenie Pavlovitch. I consider you a very good fellow indeed." "Well, in that case, you are a most delightful man to have to deal with, be the business what it may," concluded Evgenie. "Come along now, I'll drink a glass to your health. I'm charmed to have entered into alliance with you. By the by," he added suddenly, "has this young Hippolyte come down to stay with you?" "Yes." "He's not going to die at once, I should think, is he?" "Why?" "I don't know. I've been half an hour here with him, and he—" Hippolyte had been waiting for the prince all this time, and had never ceased looking at him and Evgenie Pavlovitch as they conversed in the corner. He became very much excited when they approached the table once more. He was disturbed in his mind, it seemed. Perspiration stood in large drops on his forehead. In his gleaming eyes it was easy to read impatience and agitation. His gaze wandered from face to face of those present, and from object to object in the room, apparently without aim. He had taken a part, and an animated one, in the noisy conversation of the company, but his animation was clearly the outcome of fever. His talk was mostly incoherent. He would break off in the middle of a sentence which he had begun with greatest interest, and forget what he had been saying. The prince discovered to his dismay that Hippolyte had been allowed to drink 2 large glasses of champagne, the one now standing by him being the third. All this he found out afterwards. At the moment he did not notice anything very particularly. "Did you know I am specially glad that today is your birthday?" cried Hippolyte. "Why?" "You'll soon see. Do you know, I had a feeling that there would be a lot of people here tonight. It's not the first time that my presentiments have been fulfilled. I wish I had known it was your birthday. I'd have brought you a present. Perhaps I have got a present for you, who knows? How long is it now before daylight?"
"Not a couple of hours," said Titsyn, looking at his watch. "What's the good of daylight now? One can read all night in the open air without it," said someone. "Well, the good of it? Oh, well, I want to see a ray of sun," said Hippolyte. "Can one drink to the sun's health, do you think, prince?" "Oh, I dare say one can. But you had better be calm and lay down, Hippolyte. That's much more important. You're always preaching about resting. You are a regular nurse to me, prince. As soon as the sun begins to resound in the sky—" What poet said that the sun resounded in the sky? It is beautiful, though there's no sense in it. "Then we will go to bed. Lebedeff, tell me, is the sun the source of life? What does the source, or the spring of life really mean in the Apocalypse? You have heard of the star that is called wormwood, prince? I have heard that Lebedeff explains it as the railroads that cover Europe like a net." Everybody laughed, and Lebedeff got up abruptly. "No, allow me, that is not what we are discussing," he cried, waving his hand to impose silence. "Allow me. With these gentlemen, all these gentlemen," he added, suddenly addressing the prince, "on certain points, that is." He thumped the table repeatedly, and the laughter increased. Lebedeff was in his usual evening condition, and had just ended a long and scientific argument which had left him excited and irritable. On such occasions he was apt to evince a supreme contempt for his opponents. "It is not right. Half an hour ago, prince, it was agreed among us that no one should interrupt, no one should laugh, that each person was to express his thoughts freely, and then at the end, when everyone had spoken, objections might be made, even by the atheists. We chose the general as president. Now, without some such rule and order, anyone might be shouted down, even the loftiest and most profound thought." "Go on, go on! Nobody is going to interrupt you," cried several voices. "Speak up, but keep to the point. What is this star?" "I have no idea," replied General Ivolgin, who presided with much gravity. "I love these arguments, prince," said Keller, almost more than half intoxicated, moving restlessly in his chair. "Scientific and political." Then, returning suddenly towards Evgenie Pavlovitch, who was seated near him, "Do you know, I simply adore reading the accounts of the debates in the English parliament. Not that the discussions themselves interest me, I'm not a politician, you know, but it delights me to see how they address each other. The noble lord who agrees with me, my honourable opponent who astonished Europe with his proposal, the noble viscount sitting opposite. All these expressions, all this parliamentarism of a free people, has an enormous attraction for me. It fascinates me, prince. I've always been an artist in the depths of my soul, I assure you, Evgenie Pavlovitch." "Do you mean to say," cried Gania, from the other corner, "do you mean to say that railways are accursed inventions, that they are a source of ruin to humanity, a poison poured upon the earth to corrupt the springs of life?" Gavrila Ardalionovitch was high in spirits that evening, and it seemed to the prince that his gaiety was mingled with triumph. Of course he was only joking with Lebedeff, meaning to egg him on, but he grew excited himself at the same time. "Not the railways, oh dear no!" replied Lebedeff, with a mixture of violent anger and extreme enjoyment. "Considered alone, the railways will not pollute the springs of life, but as whole they are accursed. The whole tendency of our latest centuries, in its scientific and materialistic aspect, is most probably accursed."
Is it certainly accursed, or do you only mean it might be? That is an important point,"
said Evgenie Pavlovitch. "It is accursed, certainly accursed," replied the clerk vehemently. "Don't go so fast, Lebedeff, you are much milder in the morning," said Ptitsin, smiling, "but, on the other hand, more frank in the evening." "In the evening sincere and frank," repeated Lebedeff earnestly, "more candid, more exact, more honest, more honourable, and, although I may show you my weak side, I challenge you all, you atheists, for instance. How are you going to save the world? How find a straight road of progress, you men of science, of industry, of cooperation, of trades unions, and all the rest? How are you going to save it, I say? By what? By credit? What is credit? To what will credit lead you?" "You are too inquisitive," remarked Evgenie Pavlovitch. "Well, anyone who does not interest himself in questions such as this is, in my opinion, a mere fashionable dummy." "But it will lead at least to solidarity and balance of interests," said Ptitsin. "You will reach that with nothing to help you but credit, without recourse to any moral principle, having for your foundation only individual selfishness and the satisfaction of material desires? Universal peace and the happiness of mankind as whole being the result." Is it really, so that I may understand you, sir? But the universal necessity of living, of drinking, of eating, in short, the whole scientific conviction that this necessity can only be satisfied by universal cooperation and the solidarity of interests, is, it seems to me, a strong enough idea to serve as a basis, so to speak, and a spring of life for humanity in future centuries," said Gavrila Ardalionovitch, now thoroughly roused. "The necessity of eating and drinking, that is to say, solely the instinct of self-preservation. Is not that enough? The instinct of self-preservation is the normal law of humanity." "Who told you that?" broke in Evgenie Pavlovitch. "It is a law, doubtless, but a law neither more nor less normal than that of destruction, even self-destruction. Is it possible that the whole normal law of humanity is contained in this sentiment of self-preservation?" "Ah!" cried Hippolyte, turning towards Evgenie Pavlovitch and looking at him with a queer sort of curiosity. Then, seeing that Radomski was laughing, he began to laugh himself, nudged Colia, who was sitting beside him, with his elbow, and again asked what time it was. He even pulled Colia's silver watch out of his hand and looked at it eagerly. Then, as if he had forgotten everything, he stretched himself out on the sofa, put his hand behind his head, and looked up at the sky. After a minute or two he got up and came back to the table to listen to Lebedeff's outpourings, as the latter passionately commentated on Evgenie Pavlovitch's paradox. "That is an artful and treacherous idea, a smart notion," vociferated the clerk, "thrown out as an apple of discord. But it is just. You are a scoffer, a man of the world, a cavalry officer, and, though not without brains, you do not realize how profound is your thought, nor how true. Yes, the laws of self-preservation and of self-destruction are equally powerful in this world. The devil will hold his empire over humanity until a limit of time which is still unknown." "You laugh! You do not believe in the devil! Skepticism as to the devil is a French idea, and is also a frivolous idea. Do you know who the devil is? Do you know his name? Although you don't know his name, you make a mockery of his form, following the example of Voltaire. You sneer at his hoofs, his tail, at his horns, all of them the produce of your imagination. In reality the devil is a great and terrible spirit, with neither hoofs, nor tail, nor horns. It is you who have endowed him with these attributes. But he is not the question just now." "How do you know he is not the question now?" cried Hippolyte, laughing hysterically. "Another excellent idea and worth considering," replied Lebedeff. "But again, that is not the question. The question at the moment is whether we have not weakened the spring of life by the extension of railways," put in Colia eagerly. "Not railways, properly speaking, presumptuous youth, but the general tendency of which railways may be considered as the outward expression and symbol. We hurry and push and hustle for the good of humanity. The world is becoming too noisy, too commercial," groans some solitary thinker. "Undoubtedly it is, but the noise of wagons bearing bread to starving humanity is of more value than tranquillity of soul," replies another triumphantly, and passes on with an air of pride. "As for me, I don't believe in these wagons bringing bread to humanity, for, founded on no moral principle, these may well, even in the act of carrying bread to humanity, coldly exclude a considerable portion of humanity from enjoying it. That has been seen more than once." "What these wagons may coldly exclude?" repeated someone. "That has been seen already," continued Lebedeff, not deigning to notice the interruption. "Malthus was a friend of humanity, but with ill-founded moral principles. The friend of humanity is the devourer of humanity, without mentioning his pride. For touch the vanity of one of these numberless philanthropists, and to avenge his self-esteem he will be ready at once to set fire to the whole globe. And to tell the truth, we are more or less like that. I perhaps might be the first to set a light to the fuel, and then run away. But again, I must repeat, that is not the question." "What is it then, for goodness sake?" "He is boring us. The question is connected with the following anecdote of past times, for I am obliged to relate a story. In our times and in our country, which I hope you love as much as I do, for as far as I am concerned, I am ready to shed the last drop of my blood. Go on, go on! In our dear country, as indeed in the whole of Europe, a famine visits humanity about 4 times a century, as far as I can remember, once in every 25 years. I won't swear to this being the exact figure, but anyhow they have become comparatively rare. Comparatively to what? To the 12th century, and those immediately preceding and following it. We are told by historians that widespread famines occurred in those days every 2 or 3 years, and such was the condition of things that men actually had recourse to cannibalism, in secret, of course. One of these cannibals, who had reached a good age, declared of his own free will that during the course of his long and miserable life he had personally killed and eaten, in the most profound secrecy, 60 monks, not to mention several children. The number of the latter he thought was about 6, an insignificant total when compared with the enormous mass of ecclesiastics consumed by him. As to adults, laymen, that is to say, he had never touched them. The president joined in the general outcry. "That's impossible," said he in an aggrieved tone. "I'm often discussing subjects of this nature with him, gentlemen, but for the most part he talks nonsense enough to make one deaf. This story has no pretence of being true. General, remember the siege of Kars. And you, gentlemen, I assure you my anecdote is the naked truth. I may remark that reality, although it is governed by invariable law, has at times a resemblance of falsehood. In fact, truer a thing is, the less true it sounds."
But could anyone possibly eat 60 monks?
objected the scoffing listeners. "It is quite clear that he did not eat them all at once, but in space of 15 or 20 years. From that point of view, the thing is comprehensible and natural."
Natural?
"And natural," repeated Lebedeff, with pedantic obstinacy. "Besides, a Catholic monk is by nature excessively curious. It would be quite easy, therefore, to entice him into a wood or some secret place, on false pretences, and there to deal with him as said. I do not dispute in the least that the number of persons consumed appears to denote a spice of greediness."
It is perhaps true, gentlemen,
said the prince quietly. He had been listening in silence up to that moment, without taking part in the conversation, but laughing heartily with the others from time to time. Evidently he was delighted to see that everybody was amused, that everybody was talking at once, and even that everybody was drinking. It seemed as if he were not intending to speak at all, when suddenly he intervened in such a serious voice that everyone looked at him with interest. "It is true that there were frequent famines at that time, gentlemen. I have often heard of them, though I do not know much history, but it seems to me that it must have been so. When I was in Switzerland, I used to look with astonishment at the many ruins of feudal castles perched on the top of steep and rocky heights, half a mile at least above sea level, so that to reach them one had to climb many miles of stony tracks. A castle, as you know, is a kind of mountain of stones, a dreadful, almost impossible labour. Doubtless the builders were all poor men, vassals, and had to pay heavy taxes, and to keep up the priesthood. How then could they provide for themselves, and when had they time to plough and sow their fields? The greater number must literally have died in starvation. I have sometimes asked myself how it was that these communities were not utterly swept off the face of the earth, and how they could possibly survive. Lebedeff is not mistaken, in my opinion, when he says that there were cannibals in those days, perhaps in considerable numbers, but I do not understand why he should have dragged in the monks, nor what he means by that. It is undoubtedly because in the 12th century monks were the only people who could eat. They were the fat among many lean," said Gavrila Ardalionovitch. "A brilliant idea, and almost true," cried Lebedeff, "for he never even touched a laity. 60 monks and not a single layman! It is a terrible idea, but it is historic, it is statistic. It is, indeed, one of those facts which enables an intelligent historian to reconstruct the physiognomy of a special epoch, for it brings out this further point with mathematical accuracy, that the clergy were in those days 60 times richer and more flourishing than the rest of humanity, and perhaps 60 times fatter also."
You are exaggerating, Lebedeff,
cried his hearers amid laughter. "I admit that it is an historic thought, but what is your conclusion?" asked the prince. He spoke so seriously in addressing Lebedeff that his tone contrasted quite comically with that of the others. They were very nearly laughing at him too, but he did not notice it. "Don't you see that he is a lunatic, prince?" whispered Evgenie Pavlovitch in his ear. "Someone told me just now that he is a bit touched on the subject of lawyers, that he has a mania for making speeches and intends to pass the examination. I'm expecting a splendid burlesque now."
my conclusion is vast,
replied Lebedeff in a voice like thunder. "Let us examine first the psychological and legal position of the criminal," We see that in spite of the difficulty of finding other food, the accused, or as we may say, my client, has often during his peculiar life exhibited signs of repentance and of wishing to give up his clerical diet. Incontrovertible facts prove this assertion. He has eaten 5 or 6 children, a relatively insignificant number, no doubt, but remarkable enough from another point of view. It is manifest that, pricked by remorse, for my client is religious in his way, and has a conscience, I shall prove that later, and desiring to extenuate his sin as far as possible, he has tried 6 times at least to substitute lay nourishment for clerical. That this was merely an experiment we can hardly doubt, for if it had been only a question of gastronomic variety, 6 would have been too few. Why only 6? Why not 30? But if we regard it as an experiment inspired by the fear of committing new sacrilege, then this number 6 becomes intelligible. 6 attempts to calm his remorse, and the pricking of his conscience would amply suffice, for these attempts would scarcely have been happy ones. In my humble opinion, a child is too small, I should say, not sufficient, which would result in 4 or 5 times more lay children than monks being required in a given time. The sin, lessened on the one hand, would therefore be increased on the other, in quantity, not in quality. Please understand, gentlemen, that in reasoning thus, I am making the point of view which might have been taken by a criminal of the Middle Ages. As for myself, a man of the late 19th century, I, of course, should reason differently. I say so plainly, and therefore you need not jeer at me nor mock me, gentlemen. As for you, General, it is still more unbecoming on your part. On the second place, and giving my own personal opinion, a child's flesh is not satisfying diet. It is too insipid, too sweet, and the criminal, in making these experiments, could have satisfied neither his conscience nor his appetite. I am about to conclude, gentlemen, and my conclusion contains a reply to one of the most important questions of that day and of our own. This criminal ended at last by denouncing himself to the clergy, and giving himself up to justice. We cannot but ask, remembering the penal system of that day, and the tortures that awaited him, the wheel, the stake, the fire, we cannot but ask, I repeat, what induced him to accuse himself of this crime? Why did he not simply stop short at the number 60 and keep his secret until the last of his breath? Why could not he simply leave the monks alone and go into the desert to repent? Why not become a monk himself? That is where the puzzle comes in. There must have been something stronger than the stake or the fire or even the habits of 20 years. There must have been an idea more powerful than all the calamities and sorrows of this world, famine or torture, or leprosy or plague, an idea which entered into the heart, directed and enlarged the springs of life, and made even that hell supportable to humanity. Show me a force, a power like that in this our century of vices and railways. I might say, perhaps, in our century of steamboats and railways, but I repeat, in our century of vices and railways, because I am drunk but truthful. Show me a single idea which unites men nowadays with half the strength that it had in those centuries, and dare to maintain that the springs of life had not been polluted and weakened beneath this tar, beneath this network in which men are entangled. Do not talk to me about your prosperity, your riches, the rarity of famine, the rapidity of the means of transport. There is more of riches, but less of force. The idea uniting heart and soul to heart and soul exists no more. All is loose, soft, limp. We are all of us limp. Enough, gentlemen. I have done. That is not the question. Not the question now, Excellency. I believe to sit down to the banquet you are about to provide to us. Lebedeff had roused great indignation in some of his auditors. It should be remarked that the bottles were constantly uncorked during his speech, but this unexpected conclusion calmed even the most turbulent spirits. "That's how a clever barrister makes a good point," said he, when speaking of his peroration later on. The visitors began to laugh and chatter once again. The committee left their seats and stretched their legs on the terrace. Keller alone was still disgusted with Lebedeff and his speech. He turned from one to another, saying in a loud voice, "He attacks education, he boasts of the fanaticism of the 12th century, he makes absurd grimaces, and added to that, he is by no means the innocent he makes himself out to be. How did he get the money to buy this house, allow me to ask?" In another corner was the general, holding forth to a group of hearers, among them Titsin, whom he had buttonholed. "I have known," he said, "a real interpreter of the Apocalypse, the late Gregory Semyonovitch Burmistrov, and he pierced the heart like a fiery flash. He began by putting on his spectacles, and he opened a large black book.
with his white beard and his 2 medals on his breast, recalling acts of charity, all added to his impressiveness. He began in a stern voice, and before him generals, hard men of the world, bowed down, and ladies fell to the ground fainting. But this one here, he ends by announcing a banquet! That is not the real thing." Ptitsin listened and smiled, then turned as if to get his hat, but if he had intended to leave, he changed his mind. Before the others had risen from the table, Gania had suddenly left off drinking, and pushed away his glass. A dark shadow seemed to come over his face. When they all rose, he went and sat down by Rogojin. It might have been believed that quite friendly relations existed between them. Rogojin, who had also seemed on the point of going away now, sat motionless, his head bent, seeming to have forgotten his intention. He had drunk no wine, and appeared absorbed in reflection. From time to time he raised his eyes and examined everyone present. One might have imagined that he was expecting something very important to himself, and that he had decided to wait for it. The prince had taken 2 or 3 glasses of champagne, and seemed cheerful. As he rose, he noticed Evgenie Pavlovitch, and remembering the appointment he had made with him, smiled pleasantly. Evgenie made a sign with his head towards Hippolyte, whom he was attentively watching. The invalid was fast asleep, stretched out on the sofa. "Tell me, prince, why on earth did this boy intrude himself upon you?" he asked, with such annoyance and irritation in his voice that the prince was quite surprised. "I wouldn't mind laying odds that he is up to some mischief." "I have observed," said the prince, "that he seems to be an object of very singular interest to you, Evgenie Pavlovitch. Why is that?" "You may add that I have surely enough to think of on my own account without him, and therefore it is the more surprising that I cannot tear my eyes and thoughts away from his detestable physiognomy. Oh, come on, he has a handsome face. Well, look at him! Look at him now!" The prince glanced again at Evgenie with considerable surprise. Chapter 4